Matt, I am so excited to be on your podcast, and I will only do that if you sing along. So one of the things that I love about the stage that we operate in is that nobody really knows what's going to happen.
We're going to talk about so many things. I'm so excited to have you here. You invest mainly in the very first round, unless there is a friends and family before, but the very first VC round, in between 500K up to 1 million, sometimes a bit more.
We've made over 450 plus investments since then. And yeah, it's been an amazing journey. We're in Fund 6 now.
Is there a question you would have hated me to ask? Caution, you know what's going to be the next one.
This brings us to a philosophical discussion point about what is the human experience? And is AI as a technology going to enable us to wipe out the human experience or to be able to communicate it better?
We are the average of the people we hang out with. I am Matthieu Stefani, serial entrepreneur and co-founder of Cosa Vostra, a tech and creative consulting agency. With Génération Do-It-Yourself, I offer you talks with entrepreneurs, sportsmen or artists who will literally make our average explode. I usually post in French, but I record in English from time to time, as for this episode you're about to listen. And I'd love to get your feedback. Oh, and before you start, please reach out if you need to grow in France and in Europe. At Cosa Vostra, we have a 100-plus team of amazing consultants, designers or developers based in Paris, London, and much more locations to help you grow your business. Talk to you soon. Enjoy the episode. ASMR like this, but maybe you can start again with just what you did right now. Can you do this? Can you do this again?
Matt, I am so excited to be on your podcast, and I will only do that if you sing along.
Oh, I have to sing along with a... my God, I'm not ready. I mean, you know, I want the beatbox, but I don't have the idea.
You got to have some rhymes. Come on, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
You ready?
Okay. Ici Matthieu, je suis à Londres avec Clem et Carlos sur le podcast Génération Do It Yourself. Et c'est un moment énorme. On va enregistrer cet après-midi depuis London, mec.
There you go. There's always a first time for everything.
My God. So welcome on the podcast.
Thank you.
That's already a good episode.
Already a first.
Yeah, exactly. And now I didn't put my
phone on silent.
Yeah, so on sound. So it's going to be muted.
That's just the president calling, saying he wants his podcast
it's actually someone who will listen to this episode called Raphaël Bourrier.
Nice.
Raphaël, I'm sorry, I could not answer that phone.
Raphaël, I will catch up with you later, my friend.
Yeah, he would love to do that. So
nice.
I'm happy to have you here. At Felix Capital, I will thank them also too, because they offered us this wonderful setup, isn't it? Wonderful?
Yes, Matt, thanks. And Antoine, Frederick, thanks for hosting us. Beautiful office.
And Julien, who organized that.
Yes,
also. Julien,
of course.
Good on you. So we're going to talk about so many things. I'm so excited to have you here. Where do we start? Should we? So I recorded. I'm not sure when we will release this episode. That the one I recorded yesterday with Sia will be released already. But yeah,
nice.
I mean, we have to explain that. How do you say in French? We say tordre le bras. So the idea is that you
Yes, I bent your arm.
Yeah,
I put an arm bar on you.
And I kind of like that. You know what? I don't like when people do that to me. Actually, but I like the idea that a partner, like a late founder, will explain me how it worked. Is trying to promote. A young bloke, a young guy like Sia, younger guy, and give them the light, right? So I like the whole thing you're trying to do with that, and I think he deserves it because it was a great episode. But I hated you also about.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, because as I told you, I have only founders. So when I invite someone who's not a founder, then other people who are not founders say, "Hey, look."
Yeah,
it makes a precedent. You say?
Yes, precedent.
Yeah. So thank you for this precedent.
Sorry. Well, I take it back. Let me try to rectify that precedent a little bit. I think maybe Sia might have mentioned this to you, but I think part of the reason why I suggested it is because the way we operate is very different than maybe other funds. Obviously, I can't speak for every fund, but for many funds. When Seedcamp started, Reshma and I were too young to really take a view authoritatively on anything. And we were in the early 30s. And one of the challenges that we had was that a lot of the people who were in venture at the time were people who had already started companies or had successfully sold them, or who were longtime operators. And so they would have strong opinions and they would have reasons to back it up. And Reshma and I did not, right? We had operational experience and we had other things. But one of the things that we learned was that because we didn't have that, we needed to rely on each other and we needed to rely on our community. And so we decided to make that one of our Seedcamp values. So we're community driven and we're teamwork centric. And what that means is that founders don't get one person who's an expert. In other words, when people work with us, when founders work with us, what they don't get is this one person who's a celebrity who, maybe sold a large company and then they're like the guru about everything in the company, because that's not how companies function. Companies, for a company to be innovative and to be new and novel, it has to break the rules of how things operated. By definition, it has to be different. And so that's what we did. We decided to be different. So Sia and I, and Sia and Tom, and myself and Tom, and Reshma and I, the four partners, along with Felix and Kate and other of the colleagues from the investment team, we work in squads. And those squads support our companies. And that's why I thought it was a good idea for you to have a chat with Sia, because frankly, talking to Sia and me is actually the way that a founder would talk to us. A founder wouldn't be talking to me specifically alone. A founder would be dealing with the two of us, or with Tom and Sia, or with Reshma and myself. So in some respects, your podcast is about what is a founder experiences, and this is exactly what a founder would experience, is a combination of the dynamic of what I know and what Sia knows. So hopefully your audience will enjoy this, because that's effectively what founders get when they deal with us.
It's interesting. Thanks for this introduction. We'll talk today about several things. Yeah. I'll try actually not to get the same thing as what I had with Sia yesterday.
Yes.
Even though I'm still very interesting to get your view on Europe at large. But you've written a book several times, actually. I mean, you're writing it for the third time. You explain me what changes, actually, because this is interesting, I think, the different versions to help entrepreneurs to raise money. Is that the point? Yeah?
Yeah, that's right. The book is called The Fundraising Field Guide. It's available on Amazon and other publishing networks that you can download books from. I wrote it almost 6 years ago now, the first version, and it captured a lot of the knowledge that we had accumulated over the years about a fundraising process. And I'll break down the elements of the book, and then I'll break down what's been different with each version.
Okay, we'll do that. That's very interesting.
Cool.
Before I have a couple of questions, at least one, that might take some time, sorry. And I have some other specific topics I'd like to talk about. Actually, with the emerging trends we can see in tech, because you're mostly or only in tech. I'm thinking about, quantum computing. I'm thinking about LLMs, AI, and what's the impact possibly on some of your past investment? Because, I mean, I invested in some companies where I'm thinking, wow, that's going to be dangerous, or it's going to change everything. I mean, the whole thing ChatGPT is doing when you're, I don't know, if you're into a grammar and orthograph corrector, you say that, right? I mean, you can worry a bit, right? And in some very specific fields, sometimes you can use it, but you have to be very creative and aware, at least. And also, in the future, the near future, or later on, what's your view on all of these? maybe we get the chance to talk about a bit about diversity and inclusion. Maybe we get the chance. Yesterday, I had an amazing chance, and I'll send you that podcast, and I'll recommend him for you for your podcast actually to record with a guy called Robert Plomin. Have you heard about Robert Plomin?
No, I haven't.
He's a sociologist and a genetician.
Yeah,
and he's been working for 50 years on nurture versus nature.
Yeah.
Right? And my God, I mean, this is, if you listen to him at some point, you should ask for a DNA test of every single entrepreneur you're investing in.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And
exciting.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be invasive at all, would it?
Yeah. It's quite, but yeah, at some point you're like, yeah. I mean, it makes sense. But yeah, I mean, we're going to go in some directions.
All right.
Probably you like.
Sounds good.
Let's start on this question, Carlos. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. So my name is Carlos Eduardo Espinal. I was born in Honduras. I moved over to the UK almost 15 years ago. I started off my career as an engineer, pen testing, in a company that was a derivative of Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which at the time was called GTI Internetworking, and then became Baltimore Technologies as a spinoff of GTEI. And then I joined the New York Stock Exchange's technology group called SIAC, and we were part of a team that designed the Wi-Fi and devices that are used on the trading platform floor.
All right.
And at that time, I discovered this idea of venture capital. A lot of the technologies that I was looking at for the trading floor were VC-backed companies. So it was really cool to see it from a consumer point of view, from a business development point of view. And I wanted to get into venture after I discovered what it was. Did my MBA, graduated, moved over here to the UK afterwards, and I got into venture. And in some of my early investments were in some of these technologies as part of a fund called Dowdy Hanson. Dowdy Hanson, along with other funds like Index Ventures, Local Globe at the time, and a lot of angels in the community, decided that Europe needed more of a seed stage and pre-seed stage investments. And collectively, we came together to invest in Seedcamp Fund 1.
Okay.
Seedcamp Fund 1 was very small. This was 2007, and it was a 2.5 million fund. So it could only afford one GP, and this was my colleague Reshma. So she was full-time as the sole GP in Fund 1. Saul Klein was the chairman. I was one of the mentors in the periphery, and I effectively came in as a late co-founder for Fund 2 when it was a much, much bigger 5 million fund. And so that's been ever since. We've made over 450 plus investments since then. And yeah, it's been an amazing journey. We're in Fund 6 now.
Yeah, the reason why you say it's too small is that most of the time a fund like Seedcamp takes 2%, right, of what do you say, management fees, is it? Or
yes.
So if it's 2.5 million, that makes only 50K.
Yes.
So you cannot work.
You can't operate, no.
Yeah.
So we did have an exception in Fund 1 and 2, and we had an exception from our investors to have a bigger budget, but we had to declare the budget, what it is that we used and how we spent it.
Okay.
So it was more of like an operating budget than it was like a traditional freedom. Right. So it was an investment club in a way. The first two funds were an investment club. They were also an event. We had many seed camps. We had seed camp events, seed camp weeks. But at the beginning, it was always about community building. So my career has been very funny because, you know, pretty much half of it now, if not 2/3 of it, has entirely been Seedcamp, and 1/3 of it was doing some form of engineering, whether it was in the network security consulting space or whether it was in the wireless networking side of things. And, you know, the MBA was a great opportunity to transition between the two things. I know people have divisive views on MBAs. I thought it was very helpful. I think if anybody who's coming from engineering doesn't have any kind of business skills, it's a good way of getting into it. But I came to the UK for immigration reasons, you know, being Honduran. The UK welcomed me, and yeah, I've been here ever since.
All right, nice. Do you miss being an engineer? I mean, do you miss
building stuff?
Yeah, building stuff. Or
well, the fun thing is that I've had the opportunity to build Seedcamp, you know, like, and so to some extent, building internet or software, yes, it's cool. It's very gratifying because you're at the end of the day, you can see what you've done. I think building a fund isn't quite the same. It's mostly emails, right? But it's so awesome and so rewarding to look at my colleagues and what they've achieved and our fund and what it's achieved, and knowing that that was something that was designed and built. And, a lot of the products that we've built, those needed some thinking and design, and it was done in collaboration. But at the end of the day, it's still something that I can look at. If tomorrow, if I die, I'll be like, okay, that was cool. That was great. And it made an impact.
So just for the English-speaking people that won't have the chance to listen to Sia because we recorded in French.
Yeah.
You tell me if I'm wrong. You invest mainly, so in the very first round, maybe, unless there is a friends and family before, but the very first VC-backed round, in between 500K up to 1 million, sometimes a bit more, but that's roughly what you're looking for a 5 to 8% share of the company. Is that right?
That is correct. I think another way of looking at it is less the numbers and more the intention, the stage. I think when Seedcamp started, one of the biggest things that plagued the founders was that nobody wanted to invest in them until there was traction. And that can be really irritating to a founder. I have a vision, no traction, no traction, no traction. Everybody wants to see traction. So we've built everything we've done, we've built it around the idea that we want to back people, their ideas, and their teams. And that means that, yes, we can write checks between 500K and $1 million to lead or syndicate a round. But I think what's important is that what we try to do is believe in people and their ideas. So yes, it's 5 to 8% just as a range. And that depends on, who's leading, how much is raised. All those things are variables. But I think that the intention is to be the first investor that somebody reaches out to. That's,
interesting. And it's true. I remember, the traction thing was for a long time no, you don't have traction. We won't put any money, right? Yeah. The ID thing is quite interesting. And we could dive into it right now. But so I had the chance to record with this guy called Edgar Gros-Piron. He's a quite famous French personality, as if he's been ski. What's the ski with a bus? What do you say? It goes in the fields with a lot of bumps, right?
Yeah.
And you have to make jumps. Back in '92 in Albertville, so he was Olympic champion. He was like the real. Everybody loved him so much, and so on. And he's really, he was saying, I'm going to be the Olympic champion. He'd been saying that for years, and it put a lot of pressure on him. We had great episodes with him. And he's actually recording with us a masterclass I'm going to release actually in the next fall in French to help people to become entrepreneurs, right? So it's going to be a kind of a MBA, but 6 weeks with a school called EDEC, which is in Lille, which is one of the top 10 business schools in Europe.
Yeah.
And the idea is to get the best of the method, the best of the education program, and the best of experience with a lot of my guests coming in. The best French salespeople, the best. From out of 350 guests to come in, and actually with Edgar, his skill, where he's amazing, is ambition. He explains you. There is absolutely no way you can become an Olympic champion if you don't want that. This cannot happen, right? You have to decide you will become an Olympic champion to make things, to put all of the things all together, training, coaches, travels, everything, nutrition, and so on. And then in this masterclass, he tells me, the problem with a lot of entrepreneurs is that they think about what they have and what they can do with it. And that's wrong. He just says, you have to think about what you want to do, where you want to go. I mean, nobody can send, rockets on the moon or just with his own money. You have at some point you have to raise money, right? And I think it's so right, but it's not a common thing, is it? I mean, to most of the people, and at some point you're told you need traction, you need a product, you need everything, and sometimes when you go out there and you tell to people, yeah, I've been to Seedcamp, I showed them my MVP, my PowerPoint, I don't know, my ID, and what I've done. I've recruited a couple of people that will come along, and they've given me $1 million out of a valuation of 20. People think this is insane, right? What do you say about that?
So there's a lot of questions there you asked.
And that's my specialty. I put a lot of things.
I almost need to take notes, my friend. I need to write it down and be like, all right, I think you asked me a comment about valuation, a comment about the amount of money, a comment about the stage of the companies, and a comment about the founder's ambition and so the vision. And I think those are all very good questions. Let me try to take one at a time.
Yeah.
So I think one of the unfortunate realities.
Sorry, before you start, that's my specialty. That's what Clémence, you've seen calls a tunnel.
A tunnel. Nice.
Yeah, a tunnel question. That's what I do. Okay.
Question stacking.
So now it's your tunnel time.
It's like cake. Question cake.
Yeah, exactly.
Many layers.
So you go for it, Carlos. Carlos's tunnel.
So all right. So one of the things that makes venture capital good or bad, depending on which way you look at it, is if you go to first principles of what venture is, it's a highly risky asset class that promises an outsized return in lieu of a high likelihood of failure. And in order for you to achieve that ratio of success to failure, you need those successes to be outlandishly successful to overcome a relatively large portfolio of failures. There are tons of books that talk about this, about power laws and everything like that. I'm not going to get into that because it's kind of common knowledge now. But the reason I'm starting with that is because you unfortunately have a lot of pressure on investment decision-making towards having outsized returns. And so those outsized returns require outsized parameters. And those parameters include everything from like the founder attributes, the founder vision, the size of the market, the amount of money required, and the amount of money that's going to be required down the road, right? And so each one of those things addresses all of your questions. So I'll take one at a time, right? So if you look at a specific sector or business, it needs to be able to capture enough revenue on a per annum basis so that the multiples of revenue multiplied by the comparables equals $1 billion company, because otherwise you can't make up for the losses. Now, the bigger the fund, the bigger the outcome that is needed, or the lower the risk. So this is why you see companies that are huge take less risk and still expect a relatively large outcome and high ownership stakes in the company. With a seed stage fund, if you go very small, like a very small fund, like let's say 5 million, you can tolerate smaller exits because the ratio of return relative to losses is going to be smaller. Most seed funds are somewhere between 50 million and 200 million. So that does require at least some companies to be somewhere in the 500 million and higher range to make up for the losses. So when you look at that and you unpack, what does it take to make a company that's 500 million? Well, I think there's a very good blog post that Christoph Jans wrote. Like, you can make $1 million or $1 billion or 500 million company in a very easy way. You either sell 500 million units of something, each for £1 or €1, or you sell one contract at 500 million, right? Like, they're both representations of the same mathematical equivalence. It's how do you generate 500, thousands worth of value, right? So if you expect a company to be that size, what does this mean? Well, it means that the founder needs to be thinking about how do you tackle a sector that can generate that kind of enterprise value, right? It needs to be that when we're talking to founders and the way that the story is told, the way that the market is addressed, the way the product's built, if it doesn't provide me with an image of a 500 million or higher company, it's probably going to be problematic because the fund won't be able to return, in spite of its losses, the investment. So that's the first thing. It's like the vision needs to be big enough to numerically create an illusion that can generate a return of 500 million or more. I know that sounds cold and calculated, And there's more around it. I mean, I'm just trying to answer your question as quickly as possible. But that is in effect what an investor's trying to do. They're trying to interpret a narrative into a revenue stream when multiplied by the market comparables of the moment, generate a 500 million or higher company if the fund is a seed stage fund, just for rough numbers. Okay, so then what do? Well, when the company's pre-traction, you now need to look at it with two things in mind. One of them is, what are the pre-traction elements that can signal early success? Usually that means the caliber of the founders, their experience in building companies. These are all proxies. They're all, the word is heuristics. They're all the heuristics that determine a correlation with a successful outcome. They're not guarantees, but they're just correlations, right? So for example, if somebody's building an AI company, they left DeepMind, their colleague is ex-OpenAI, and you're just assuming things. But it's not a bad assumption. And that's where you start hoping that team multiplied by a big idea equals an outsized return. When you look at most companies, and this statistic's old now, somebody did an analysis of how much money has been raised for a company to hit a certain valuation of somewhere like 200 million or higher. And I, at the time when this study was done, it was at least 6 years ago, it was something like 40 million that had to be raised. So let's just use that for my example. Actually, the actual number doesn't matter, but it gives you an idea of what I'm going to go with. Most investors want to make sure that the founders have some success in any kind of exit. Of course, if the company has been so diluted by investors that at exit the founder has nothing, then there's very little likelihood the company and the founders are going to be motivated to get it to success.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is that there is a perception of how much ownership each stage of an investment cycle an investor should take, so that the founder is not in as 100% dilution. So if over the course of, let's say, 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, a company raises that theoretical 40 million, the goal is not to over dilute the founder so that there isn't, and I think that average statistic is somewhere like 20 to 30% ownership of the founder at exit. I think I was reading that recently.
All right.
But that's it didn't have the specifics of what stage they had exited. So in other words, how many rounds. But let's just pretend for a second that was true. That means that the valuation of each round needs to be relative to the amount raised. And with the amount raised for companies in AI right now, for example, some of them are raising 40 million, 50 million in one round, 200 in one round. It means that every round has to be calibrated to not over dilute the founding team so that when there's follow-on funding, there isn't any issues with over dilution, which then ends up with the company having 100% ownership by the investor shareholder base. So that's how you end up with a rough calculation as to why at pre-seed and seed, there is a ratio of how much money to what percentage. And that percentage at pre-seed to seed, I gave you a long-winded mathematical explanation to come to this very specific thing. And I actually talk about it in the book a little bit, which is at pre-seed and seed, roughly, whatever it is that you're raising is roughly divided by 15% to about 22%. If you draw that as a bell curve, will give you your post-money valuation on average.
15 to 22.
Yeah, that's if you draw a bell curve, meaning a bell curve is a good way to represent probability. It's not always likely that you're going to have more than 22% dilution in the syndicate of seed or pre-seed investors. And the likelihood is that you're not going to go in 2023 below 15%, maybe 12 if you get lucky. So if you draw that and you take whatever money you're raising, let's say you're raising 1 million or 2 million, and you divide by 0.15 and you divide by 0.20, you'll get a range of what your likely valuation range is. And that's how valuations are done. It's because I gave you the final result, but that final result is a compounding of multiple rounds that add up to a non-100% fully dilutive event for founders at an exit.
That's exactly what I told Sia actually yesterday. I said, so let's say you take you put 1 million, then you will value the company at 4, and the post-money valuation will be 5, and you get 20%. And then he said, well, we mostly take from 5 to 8%. So that's where you want to go, I believe. You don't go to 12 or 15% in those rounds. why and what's the outcome? I mean, at the end.
So I like to jump around between practical answers and the theoretical. And the reason why the theoretical is important, because sometimes it can be overly complicated, but it's important because it sits within a larger picture, right? When I started to explain to you the fact that at exit, you want to avoid the founder having been diluted to zero. And there's a reason why that. Because if an investor down the road thinks that the founding team is overly diluted, they will not invest. And so we, being the first investors in the cap table...
I've been through that already. Yeah, I've seen that.
With us being the first investors in the cap table, we're constantly calibrating through how much is too much, how little is too little. And we're constantly trying to figure out the right balance between the fact that we're representing our shareholders and the people who've given us money to invest and to enable companies to grow, but at the same time, enabling founders to have the best opportunity to raise money downstream. And that's changed over the years. I mean, just to give you an idea how that's changed, in 2010 or so, for 150K, not just like any seed stage investor would get somewhere like 15 to 20% for 150K. Like it wasn't unheard of in 2010, right? And that's like 13 years ago. €1 million
valuation on seed. Yeah.
And that's changed.
Yep.
And so, the question will be, well, what's changed? Well, a lot of things have changed. First of all, there's currency inflation. We've got to factor that in. The costs of building a company, cost of acquisition, cost of employee salaries. Those are all sort of, let's call it inflationary pressures. But there's another thing, which is that it just takes more money to raise, to build a company. And because there's more money that is required to build a company, and there's external factors that affect that other than inflation, like competitiveness. Competitiveness manifests itself in having to outspend your competitors, right? And because of that, it means that you still need to have the same equivalent non-dilutive impact on the cap table early on, except more money needs to go in. So when you take an increase in capital, but you hold constant the dilution, you end up with a higher valuation. And that's why valuations have changed since 2007 to now, is partially inflationary, but partially cost of operating.
Interesting. And when you put actually the first signal, the first valuation at 20 million with a €1 million invested, I mean, that puts a lot of pressure on the founding team to go big, because on the next round, when they will want to raise the 5, they will have to go up to 40, 50 million maybe. So it sets probably the mindset, and it puts a lot of pressure on the next investors too, I believe.
It does. But let me just clarify for your listeners here. Seedcamp doesn't propose a specific valuation for a company. Like right now you're saying 20 million. And I know that you're using it as an example, but let me just kind of
it's important.
Unpack that a little bit. I know that we're going to talk about my book a little bit down the road, but I think one of the chapters...
We can go in now. I mean, it's okay.
Well, no, it's a good segue to tell you what's changed in the new version. For those of you that are listening, this is the first time I'm telling anyone about the third version. And what's changed over the third version is that I wrote the first version during the linear growth of the last decade in company valuations and startup ecosystems. I wrote the second version during the COVID pandemic when everything was going up to the right very quickly. There was so much inflation that if you look at the cover art of my second book, instead of writing a term sheet, the artwork has a little X with the number instead of millions, because I was afraid that in a year or two, the book would be out of date if I wrote a specific number. Because round sizes were growing so quickly that if I wrote a number, I was like, crap, in 2 years, it'll go from 2 million to 5 million to 8 million. And so I wrote a little X. And what's interesting about this third version, it's now that that's been reduced. And so I wanted to unpack this issue of valuation pressure, because we're seeing that more and more now. So to your point about 20 million and pressure, we're seeing now in 2023 more flat rounds, more rescue rounds or bridge rounds, as it's also called. And we're seeing companies that raise too much at too high valuation, struggling to raise at all. And there's a couple of factors for that. One of them is one of the challenges with raising so much money at such a high valuation is that it warps the minds of everyone around the table. It makes sometimes the dynamics of the team feel like money's infinite. Sometimes it makes employees in the company feel like money is something that they should have access to, whether it be a higher pay or something. When you look at a company where the founding team didn't raise as much, the psychology of the team is that they have to do more with less. And that filters across the organization. Like people are getting paid with equity, not with cash. When a company raises 100 million or 50 million, everybody knows when they see the press release that money is not a problem. And so there's a higher expectation for salaries. There's a higher expectation for everything, for all the perks and everything.
AdWords.
Yeah, exactly. And so part of the challenge with these big rounds or these big valuations is that they come with adverse effects psychologically, but also adverse effects in that it's harder to raise the next round, because the next round means you have somebody with high expectations for what success should have looked like to justify a doubling of that valuation. So if your last round was 50 million and now the second round is going to be an 80 million raise or 100 million raise and you haven't done much, most people are just going to say, no, thanks, man. That's great. And I love what you're doing. Because investors really struggle with being upfront and direct. Like, hey, man, it was too much money last time. I don't think you've done enough with this valuation to justify doubling of it. So I'm going to pass. Most people won't say that because why, right? It's a destructive thing to say.
I was about to ask, would you do that? But you don't do those rounds.
I don't do those rounds anyway. Yeah. But that's what I hear. You know, from talking to other founders and other things, it's a soft no. And the question is that a good thing? No, it isn't. Like the ideal scenario is for a founder to raise just the right amount of money at the right valuation. I know that's kind of like we can talk about what the word right means, but it's clear that there's a point which is affecting a lot of companies now. Raising too much can be a bad thing, unless there's very few cases where more money. And what I mean by more money is like at a seed stage, raising more than the average is justified. There's some cases where it's justified. Other cases, you're just setting yourself up for complications. Not even a guaranteed problem, but just complications that come with that.
When I listen to you, I'm just figuring out that, you know, when you see a company that has raised, let's say, 50 million an evaluation out of, 150, and 2 years later, they raise another, maybe 30 million at a valuation of 150 or 200. Let's say it's the same post-money valuation that last time. Like wow, that smells bad. You're like kind of this is shit. And I don't know. At some point, we could see some companies that are still worth, 100, like half of what they were worth, that would raise 30 million. I know that investors wouldn't be happy. I know that founders would probably be diluted a bit more, but still, it's worth 100 million, right? And it's not that bad. But it seems it doesn't happen much. Most of the time, or the worst is to stay at the same valuation, or you just go to the bin, right? Does that happen? Is it about to happen more? Would we have really downturns, like big time downturns?
Yeah, this is another tunnel question.
Yeah.
So let's start off with public markets, right? Big public markets.
I will change the podcast name. The
tunnel questions. When you look at what's happened in the last 6 months in the stock market, right? Even more, like 9 months, there's been clearly a correction, and that
we're recording in summer 23, right?
Yes, yeah. That's right. And that correlation is naturally tied to the cost of capital, right? The cost of capital has gone up because of interest rates going up. That's compressed a lot of perception of risk in the public market, because if you can get a guaranteed return in sort of a safer treasury or gilt or something, you can get a less of a justification for a high risk asset, right? And so you start looking at risk differently when cost of capital goes up. And that's oversimplifying it a little bit. But what you see is there's a collapse in the value of some companies that were valued in the multiples of billions. And you're seeing that cut in half or cut by 60%. And some of them, the revenues were affected a little bit, but not equivalent to the reduction in value.
Yeah.
So what's changed? Well, what's changed is the perception of value of the future growth.
Yeah.
And the value of the future growth was predicated on money being free and money just growing on trees. So there's clearly an evaporation of expectation. Probably that's a way of looking at it. And the same thing happens, if that happens at the public market, it also happens at the growth stage. It also happens at the early stage. At the public stage, evaporation of growth and expectation means that there's a compression in the revenues, but there's not an evaporation of revenues. There's just a compression of revenues. So those companies generally don't go bankrupt because there's enough of a clientele there and they suffer the stock price decline, but there's still a value that stock has.
Yeah.
Whereas in early stage, when, for example, there's a downturn, most early stage companies, let's say it's an enterprise company, they may not have stable contracts. They may have a proof of concept or a potential letter of intent with a potential enterprise customer. So if those contracts don't start or they get eliminated as part of a cost-cutting exercise in large enterprise, it doesn't have the same effect as it would at a public company. It just gets wiped out.
Yeah.
And so now what you have is a company that raised too much money, perhaps, without any revenue and without any visibility on revenue. And that's when you start worrying that company is going to die, because then you don't have any of the elements that define value. You don't have the expectation for growth. You don't have contracts. You have a high burn, and you just lost all the opportunity for growth. And so that's on the other extreme. And then there's the middle, which is the question you were asking me. The middle is these growth stage companies where there is a equivalent, contraction. You lose some people. And what those companies try to do is they try to cut costs, similar to what public companies do. They try to cut costs, reduce burn. And then, of course, with that, you still need more money because many of them aren't cash flow positive. So you end up having to raise on a flat round to incentivize people to take the risk on something that isn't as liquid or as certain as a public company. So that's the logical explanation for that question. It's like, that's all quite rational, but that's where you can see it affects early stage companies far worse than it does medium growth stage to public stage, because early stage can actually have a complete evaporation of the commercial traction that a company might have had.
Okay. Thank you. It's very clear. It's very clear, and you see actually some of those companies that were valued 200 million, and now they go back to probably to 100 or something. They just have a 3 million income. I mean, it's like still very tiny. So you're kind of as the growth is not coming as expected, it's going to be harder.
Yeah. But a question you didn't ask me, but you could ask me is, okay, fine. If there's a correction, why not have it be more aggressive? Like, why not take it from 200 million down to 20 million? If it only has 3 million in revenue in this theoretical company, why not bring it down more? And it has to go back to that original principle that I told you, which is most investors don't want to over dilute a company so that the company can no longer raise money. Because then if it needs further money, it probably won't be able to raise it. So if you overly compress it, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. So there's this fine balance all investors, all existing shareholders are asking themselves, okay, clearly this company doesn't merit anything other than a flat round. Maybe it's even a down round. But how much of a down round before you actually affect the company? You're probably going to wipe out all existing investors. But even then, how much do you want to wipe out the management team? Because if the management team is not engaged, then you really don't have anything. Yeah. So that's why you don't see this complete wipeout, is that there's a fine balance between contracting relative to what's happening across the market and complete collapse.
Great. I before we get to the how to raise money chapter, the question I'm asking myself, because the more I see VC funds, seed rounds, and even later, the more I see most of you guys looking for I mean, the moonshot, right? And I'm thinking, you know what? I mean, I get the point. Obviously, I get the point. You explained it. If you have from 15 to 200 million, isn't there a lack of investors in the tech area for companies that will be worth, 30 million or 50, 100, maybe for the good ones? I mean, it seems that to me, or maybe I don't know those guys, but maybe they're less visible. But it seems nobody's looking for that kind of thing, or they're just accidents of the ones looking for. But what I'm thinking is that when you see the money founders get out of, sometimes companies that are sold billions is specific, but sometimes they don't make that much. I mean, you see that some companies that have been sold 250 million, and the two co-founders or three co-founders, they take 20 million each, right?
Yeah.
It's great. I mean, I'll take 20 million if you have for me. But obviously, at some point, you would think, what if we go take a company smaller and make more money out of it?
Yeah.
So is there a hole in that area, or am I wrong?
Another fun question, Tunnel.
Yeah.
I think you're asking me a couple of questions here. So one of them is exit windows. Mm-hmm. How many exit windows exist, and are there is there an efficient alignment of investors to those exit windows? Is there a 1-to-1 ratio of, for companies from 0 to 10 million, is there investors? From 10 to 20 million, there's investors. So that's one question, right? And another question, I think, is this idea of will investors adapt their expectations to settle for lower returns? So let's try to take that last one first. I think it's an interesting one. In every single venture capital fund model, there is a hope that every company is going to be successful, but there is an expectation that a percentage will be some subset of that. When I made the fund model for Seedcamp Fund 4, one of the things that I did was I took a percentage based upon all the companies that we saw and aligned that percentage multiplied by the multiple of return to the fund. So 10x, 9x, 8x, 7x, 6x, 2x, 1x, 1x. So the average investment was 100,000, just to pick a number. It would be something like a certain percentage of companies would give us 1x, right? 2x would be 200,000, 3x, 300,000, and so. The breakdown was something like 1% would give us 10x or more. Anything between, let's say, 1x and 5x was more like 5%, and the rest was 1x or below. So as long as that model played out the way I expected it, the fund would return the promised 3 to 5x overall to our investors.
Yep. Within
that range, there is a happiness, a expectation that some companies will not be $1 billion or 500 million. They could be 50 million, and that's okay. So to address your question, all investors are okay with a variety of exits. But that being okay with an exit doesn't necessarily mean that it returns the fund. So I don't think any investor is unhappy with any kind of positive return on capital. I think that that's a good thing. It's always fine. And if it works out for everyone, there's a variety of companies that benefit from a good exit versus going to zero because they chose no exit. And there's a whole philosophy behind that statement.
We'll keep the other part of the question, but my comment on that is important. I think it's if you're an entrepreneur and if you go to a fund, a VC fund, a seed fund, and you don't show up with an idea that will be worth billions, I mean, what I'm saying is a large part of you guys will not invest because it's not worth the risk, right?
Sort of. This brings me to the first part of your question.
And that means...
Let me tackle that one first, and then we'll come back to it.
Okay.
So that has to do with the efficiency of capital available for every stage of risk. So right now in this conversation, we've talked a little bit about the expectation is that every company's $1 billion. That's not entirely factually true. I think there's a percentage of companies that I would like for them to be over $1 billion, some that I would like for them to be over 500, some that I would like for them to be 100. And our fund is 143 million pounds. If our fund were 20 million, that number would be much lower. If our fund was 5 million, which is maybe what an angel's portfolio might look like, that would be even lower. And so the question you're asking is, how many people, how many investors exist for each one of those bands? So for example, if you're an angel and you invest 100,000, right? Getting a 10x, right? Getting $1 million return on that is really nice.
Yeah.
For you to have $1 million in a company, that exit doesn't have to be very big. Why? Because the ownership that angel is taking is not much to begin with. It'll probably be like a 5%. And then on top of that, you have the exit scenario. You probably only raised from 2 or 3 other angels, and that was your round. So you could have a 20 million exit with a bunch of angels, and everyone's happy. Okay, so is there enough angels to cover companies that only have a 20 million exit? I would say that that's much better today than it ever has been. This is why Crowdcube exists. This is why Seeders exists. This is why, if you look at most retail brands,
a lot of club deals,
exactly.
Just come in.
If you look at like drinks companies, or if you look at food or anything like that, those are retail companies. Those retail companies in public markets, the enterprise value multiple on revenues isn't very high because it just is an industry that is like a 2x or 3x multiple on revenues. And so that means that those companies can be working really hard, generating pretty good revenue, but they're never going to be worth billions of dollars or pounds. So you have 20 million exits, 50 million exits to a strategic buyer or something like that. Any angel who was in that company made a lot of money. The founder made a lot. Everyone's happy, right? But those deals are not the deals that maybe some of the bigger funds would invest in, because that return doesn't correlate to the risk they take. So Europe today has a high, like in London, in Germany, in France, in the Nordics, there is high efficiency of capital at the early and at the late early. So in other words, there's enough angels and enough seed stage funds to cover a lot of those kinds of investments. Where it gets trickier is in the late growth. That's where you see a lot of American funds coming in to supply capital for companies that are growing a little bit more, the growth capital side of things. That's where there's less money. So there is good data around this. I don't have it in front of me, but there's good data that showcases how many investors are investing at certain stages. And to your question, yes, people are happy at 20, at 30, at 50, 100. And so when we're having a conversation about a fund like mine, we're happy with 500 and higher, but we understand that some exits are 10 to 20, 20 to 50, 50 to 100. And ultimately, my job is to make sure the founder's successful, right? And so, yes, of course, if we're talking about the ultimate return for the fund, it has to be 1 or 2 really amazing wins, a bunch of that are pretty good wins, some that are successful. But overall, it'll be fine. And what's more important to me is that the individual founder had a good experience and was successful as best they could be. And that, if I do that enough, you will have the numbers. And that's how the fund operates.
The other comment I could do about that was we say it in French with an English word that might not be English, but I would say it, which is retailization, like Crowdcube, Seeders. We have like Super Capital, Anaxago, some brands like that in France too. Sometimes I feel like, the party is over. Like most of the seeds, are harder to get. So, let's raise money from amateurs, and they will get, they've always wanted to get in the game. And now it's easier because there is less money. But, it's like you're just coming after the party guys, and I feel sometimes a bit bad about that because, you feel there are quite a few shitty files on those platforms. There are, I mean, obviously, but as everywhere else. But what do you think about that?
So it's funny. It's funny how you refer to it as such, right? Because,
but and at the same time, I love it. I think
I get that.
Yeah, I do my own. How do you say? Not round table club deals and,
Yes.
and stuff like that. But I feel it's a new kind of party that is not good for everyone.
So one of the things that I love about the stage that we operate in is that nobody really knows what's going to happen. You know, today's company that isn't doing particularly well is tomorrow's company that does amazingly well. I think, I don't know if Sia, my colleague, in his interview talked about Sorare, but Sorare is one of those companies we invested when everybody was not investing in the sector. And then, of course, now it's a huge company, right?
Yeah, I would have never put 1,000 euros in. I've received Nicolas. I told him in the podcast. I mean, that was really, really, really bold.
Yeah,
I think.
And so I think one of the biggest problems we have is we make mistakes as investors and as people in judging something for where it is today, not where it will be. So I think crowdfunding platforms, club deals, and all these things have some element of miscalibration. And therefore, that miscalibration comes from the fact that maybe you're looking at it versus other people looking at it. It's like it's the weird Groucho Marx thing. I think it was Groucho Marx that said, like, I don't want to be part of a club that takes me as a member. I think it's attributed to him. Correct me if I'm wrong on the comments. But basically, the premise is, if I am seeing this deal as a crowdfunding person, does that mean that other people passed on the deal? And that's one of the questions that everyone asks themselves in this industry, by the way. Everyone asks themselves this question. If I'm looking at it, why isn't somebody else already done the deal?
Yeah.
What does that say about it, right? And I think that this fundamentally gets to the root of the problem that our industry has, is that our industry is an extrapolation of expectations and emotions. That's what our industry is at pre-seed and seed. It's an extrapolation of expectations on what the people can do and emotions about where they are today. And where it gets complicated is that the context in which people meet the founding team shapes that expectation. So if you meet them in a crowdfunding platform, the expectation shifts towards, why are they here?
Yeah.
Whereas if you meet them as a passing comment while you're at Felix Capital's offices, you're wondering if you're in the know of something secret that nobody should know. Nothing's different. It's just the context, right? And so I think that one of the things that we'd like to encourage founders, anybody who's listening, is that it's hard to know that this is how the system works. And it's not a system that anybody's designed. It's just human nature. It's just human nature, right? This is why when you're younger, you're like, which party should I go to? Where should I be? This is why social media has taken so much of a grasp. It is the context. Context matters. And whenever the context is not in your favor, because it's not always in your favor, if you're a company who has been rejected a few times, that has nothing to do with whether you're going to be successful or not. It just means you've been rejected a few times, right? It's what you do with it. And so the first chapter of the book that I wrote is about mindset. It's about the mindset of rejection. It's about the mindset of context, of harnessing what you are capable of doing in spite of expectations put on you and the emotions that are around you. And those emotions could be, oh, these people aren't smart enough, or they're not this or that. Or they're just guesses. Most people don't know what you're capable of as a founder, and they're just guessing on heuristics, on your LinkedIn profile, on what you've done in the past.
On the way you look at them, on the way you speak, on the way you move, on many things.
And that's the way we are as people, right? So I think sometimes people, the media or others, can get overly critical of investors. But it isn't investors. Let's just face it. That's how everyone is, right? Everyone is, whether it be for romantic purposes, for business purposes, it doesn't matter. We all exist in a world where first impressions matter and where we make our decisions based on as little information as possible, because it could be the difference between life and death, right? That's how we've been shaped as human beings. So it doesn't surprise me that then we drag that into the world of investing, and therefore we impose expectations on people and leverage our emotional impression of the context on that interaction to think, is this a good deal or is it a bad deal?
I'm just thinking about Romain Raffard, who's the founder of Bergamote. Bergamote in France is a quite famous flower distributor. A fantastic episode I recorded with him. This business is so difficult. I mean, flowers are just when you get them from Amsterdam, you have to sell them within like 36 hours, or you will just throw them away. I mean, it's crazy organization. And he told me because of that, actually, mostly, but not only, he had to see 150 VCs before he could raise money, and he did a pretty good deal. He sold this to actually a British company. A couple of years ago, I think. So you're right. I mean, it's just a question of, keeping going. Maybe you have to correct some things, but resignation probably at some point, or perseverance mainly.
It is. It's perseverance, but there's perseverance where you're just hitting your head the same way. Then there is iterative perseverance, where you're reflecting on what happened, what you could do, ignore the things that you can't change, and then change the things that you can.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the hard part. And this is where it helps to have a co-founder, because the co-founder can say, hey man, the way you said that, I could see that the investor's face changed when you said that. And maybe it was because you said this versus that. And you can calibrate, right? So calibration is important as part of this iterative approach. And I think like one of the people who did this to an art, and I'm just picking on somebody I think everyone will know, is Adam Newman from WeWork.
Yep.
Like he was so good at channeling the emotions of the people he spoke to that he was able to use that for his benefit, right? That's somebody who's so good at that, inspiring and like changing the context in his favor. And that's one extreme of it, right? And then, of course, people who are not able to do that and change the emotional context in which they're operating in, then they suffer from it, right? You can either benefit from it or you can suffer from it.
I see. If you see, actually, we'll get into that now, but when you want to raise money, we talked about those platforms. Is it a good place to start? Is it the place where you end up when you didn't raise money somewhere else?
Yeah.
What's your vision on this? Where do you start, actually?
Yeah, I mean, crowdfunding isn't today. I think I understand why you're asking me the question, but it's no longer that way. I mean, I don't know, maybe in France it might be that way.
It's a bit like
but in the UK it's not like that anymore, because now the platforms know that in order for you to, as an investor, not feel like you got taken advantage of as a crowdfunder, there has to be somebody taking and leading the risk that is institutional. So
you co-invest with Seedcamp, for example, or
and I think a lot of companies are using now the crowdfund as a way of connecting with their customer.
That's exactly. I mean, the idea. I think it's a very good idea at the beginning. But yeah.
So at least in the UK, from the Crowdcube and Seeders, I know that they take a lot of effort in making sure that what is available on the platform is more about being part of a brand or syndicating with another investor, rather than as the investor of last resort. I think those days are. I don't know if they were ever fully there, but I think there was less. Now there's concentration of those two main platforms in the UK. And when there were more sort of outlier crowdfunding platforms, I think it was more of that game.
Okay. Yeah, I think there is still kind of a disdain. Can you say that? Yeah. Did not know. Kind of, you look at, in France, people look at them still like, yeah, right.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a bit. So where do we start when you want to raise money? Should we ask why first? Is it the first question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why raise money?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Why? Why am I raising money? Am I raising money because I want to be on a public-facing press release, or is it because I want fame and fortune, or is it because I want to change the world? I think one of the things that we probably don't talk about enough is not all businesses need venture capital. There's a lot of businesses, back to your original question about exits at different sizes. There's plenty of businesses around the world that make good revenue that don't require venture capital, can get cash flow break even quite quickly, and they're just good businesses. So I think that venture capital is a specific product for specific companies, right? Like if you're building a real estate business with 3 properties, then you rent out, that's not a venture capital business. If you're building a consultancy where you're billing hours of your professionals to other people, that's not really a venture capital business. But if you're building a software product that could go global within 6 months and capture the way people work, yeah, that's probably a venture capital product because it needs money quickly at high risk to be able to deliver on that growth. And that's the difference between venture and everything else. So I think there's a fundamental question you need to ask yourself. Is this business, is this idea that I have, why am I doing it? And if I'm doing it for something like I want to be a billionaire, then, well, you have to think about that. I mean, I'm not going to judge anybody's reasons why they're doing it, but you're going to want to think, okay, is my idea commensurate with that ambition? And if it is, great. But if it isn't, then you need to rethink your idea. Now, if your idea is, let's say, venture capital type idea, then you got to ask yourself, well, what country am I in? What geography am I in? Who are the people I need to talk to? What sector am I in? Because there's different investors for different things. One of my friends here in the UK, his name is Lars. He's got a quantum investment fund, and that fund specializes in quantum computing. I mean, that's very special, right? Very special.
I've received a couple of guests in the area. Yeah.
Most investors don't touch it because it's so specialized.
Yeah.
And so if you're a company that is building a quantum product, you're probably going to want to talk to him, right? And if you just go and talk to any random fund or angel, they may not invest simply because they don't understand. And so I think that's the next thing, is calibrating who your customer is. In this case, who you need to be talking to, why you're doing this, who are you going to be talking to. And then once you have that, is how much money you need, right, to achieve what you need to achieve as a first validation point. And then you just need to get yourself into the mindset of that and build yourself the right materials to be able to go out and have those conversations and then iterate on those materials. And materials is everything from your pitch to your emails to your tone to your branding to the demo to all that is the product for a fundraise. And you have to iterate on that. And so that allows you to know who you're talking to, why you're talking to them, what's the story. And that's the beginning of it. And you just have to be armed with the confidence that you're going to get rejected. In the book, I talk about one of our founders who got rejected 80 times before he got a yes. And he had only a few euros in his bank account before he got that yes. So, sometimes it can be very tight. But as long as you have all those attributes, that's how a fundraise gets kicked off.
Yeah, interesting. I'm that's a lot of thoughts I have at the same time, because sometimes, even you say some businesses need to raise money, and sometimes you can get two competitors, that one that raises, not the other one that doesn't. And I take a common example. Most of the time, the one that doesn't raise money will not spend a lot of ads, because unless he finds a good spot on the ROI. But sometimes if you raise money, you're okay with spending a lot of money to acquire customers with no ROI at the beginning, right? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so the routes sometimes are much better. The thing is that you see competitors that have raised and that are going much faster on many things. And it raises a lot of questions sometimes on those areas, because you're just like, which one is right? I mean, and you can't answer to that question.
Yeah.
But you must have seen that several times.
Yes. This is now entering into the philosophy of cash burn, right? So there's different philosophies of cash burn, and those philosophies change depending on the cost of capital. If you look at late 2020s, you see, late
2010s.
Late 2010s, yeah. You see a high propensity to spend to acquire. now in a more capital efficient time frame, and all the platforms kind of all the hacks have been kind of reduced, you see more people more conservative. So I think it depends when your company was born and what strategy was used. So I think there's no such thing as a strategy that lasts forever. So I think one of the tricky things is that two companies might start at the same time. They might have entirely different growth hacks and growth strategies, but then the outcome isn't necessarily what you think it is. So for example, some companies, and I won't name names here, partially because I'm invested in a couple of them, but one example is a company who is successful today, but has had a lot of churn in customers because the product had a lot of corners cut. And what I mean by that is that they grew so fast that the stability of the product and the reliability of the product was questionable. Whereas another company raised less, focused entirely on the quality and experience, but didn't have the scope. And so now they're picking up those customers little by little, little by little. And I don't know if they will ever come to the same size as that other player. But the interesting thing is the game's not over yet.
Yeah.
And so sometimes growing too fast comes at a cost long term that you won't find out until 5, 6, the game's over when it's over.
Yeah.
And so if you look at it at any given point in time, sometimes you think another player's winning. I'll use another example that's just a little bit more public, so it's easier to talk about. Monzo versus Revolut.
Yeah.
So we invested in Revolut after Monzo was first, really. I mean, Monzo was the first in the market, maybe not chronologically, but in terms of capturing this idea of a neobank in the UK. And so when Revolut came out, a lot of people were already on Monzo, and it was well known. It had that nice coral card. And Nikolai from Revolut was launching into a market that had captured some of the venture capital funds entering into this neobank space.
Right.
And when we invested in it, it wasn't 100% sure that he was going to be able to cannibalize those customers away from Monzo. But the interesting thing is that since that's happened, since those early days, they didn't need to. They didn't need to cannibalize it because there was so much untapped market. There were so many people that wanted a neobank solution that Revolut outpaced Monzo with a bunch of other products, expanded much, much more quickly globally. And so therefore it went from being seemingly the underdog because they didn't have the right investors at the time, or the first investors, to now the dominant player. And so that's why sometimes, again, the game's not over until it's over. So I think sometimes people need to focus on their lane, their race they're running, get the best money they can, raise as much money as they can within reason for the points that we discovered earlier in this podcast, and then just focus, because otherwise you can really get distracted with like, oh, my competitors raised this and that and that. You have to be aware of what they're doing, but these games of like outspending and doing this, those games I think are easier to play when there's free money, which ended like about a year ago.
Yeah. The other remark I had when I listened to you is that can it be sufficient to have a founder whose motivation is become a billionaire? I mean, can it work? Can it be enough?
So it's a fun question because it's reducing people's motivations down to a variable that is inherently private. I don't think anybody would really, really tell you that. I think I am friends with many of our founders, and I think that people are complicated. They're multidimensional. Many founders and many fund managers and many people who start things have deep insecurities. And that's what drives you to build. Many creators have deep insecurities, and that's what drives you to create, right? To explain. And those scars, those emotional scars, shape you into being multidimensional in what you seek from success. For some people, it's validation. For some people, it's financial success. For some people, it's freedom. You don't truly know. So I think the question is valid. Like, will money alone drive somebody? I'm sure that there's some people who are like that, but in my experience, I don't know that I've ever met somebody where money's the sole driver. Like, you can kind of tell that in some cases they're very commercially driven, and that means that they have a higher likelihood of being driven by success financially. But I don't think I've ever come across somebody who's just one-dimensional. So it's a very hard one to answer because it's usually compounding variables. You know, in some cases it's altruism, and you can tell when somebody's doing something altruistically. Like, the entire KPI set is changing the world. And you can also tell when somebody's business and business model and everything is around generating cash. But it's not always clear that that person, just because they want to generate cash, has no sense of community or giving back, or it's hard to unpack that singularly.
No, the question was actually, you know, I think in the past 10 years, I mean, we all wanted to hear that answer, that the mission was more important, and I've seen people on my podcast, and I've met a lot of people that were, I mean, I don't think it's actually the money itself. It's probably it's the measurement it represents. You know, I'm a billionaire. He's got 1.5 billion, but how comes? I mean, how comes he get more money than I do? You know, it's more of a like a,
that's an Instagram meme. Yeah, there's a few of those out there. I think most people don't not like that. Most people I know are not like that. Even the ones that are very successful, they're not that one-dimensional. I think it's fun for TV and Instagram, but I don't know if they're that. There's probably a few characters that we know out there who are like that. But I think I wanted to just touch on another point on that. Obviously, it's very hard to talk about other people, right? But I can talk about myself, and I can talk about my colleagues to some extent.
Interesting, yeah.
You know, to date, we've had the pleasure of working with many founders, and also we've had the benefit of being able to be part of their stories, the successful ones like UiPath and Tavit from TransferWise, and all of them, and my relationship with them, and all of them, in my perception of my equivalent relationship with that success, is that there's always a desire to share that success with others. And it's not just about financial sharing, it's also about bringing people along in that journey, changing the environment around you, helping build something that's bigger than you. And this is kind of hard to put into like a series of like bullet points that you say, well, these are the 3 things that people want. Every single conversation that I've had with some of these founders, they may not say the same thing, but they will all say something that sounds like they're thinking about something bigger than just the financial success. Almost always it's comments around the culture that they've built, the enablement that they've allowed others to have, the growth that they've seen in other people, the communities that they've created, the jobs they've created. Like, there's all these other elements, and they come up so much in the conversation that I have to imagine that that's on their mind more often than how much money they have.
All right. I see. What is if we get back to this how to raise money and the book you've written, we're not going to give away all the book, although I believe you didn't write this book to make money. It's more to help people, I guess. But where do we start? What are the most important things or the most common mistakes people who raise money go to and do?
So the book is in 3 parts. So the first part we talked about briefly, which is the mindset. Right? Mm-hmm. You need that. If you don't have that, then it becomes problematic for you to actually successfully raise, because you're going to find yourself making the same mistakes over and over again.
The second, entrepreneur mindset, you mean?
The entrepreneur mindset.
Okay, let's do the second.
The second part is largely around the preparation. So what you need to fundraise. So fundraising in of itself is a product. You're selling equity. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I mean, you have a product that's called equity. You're selling it, and you're selling it with tools. What are those tools? Your deck, your email, your communication, your pitch, your tone, your meetings. That's what you're selling, right? And so it's important to think about it as a product because you don't take shortcuts with your software. Why would you take shortcuts with your investment product? And so the second part of the book is around how to get that in order. And the third part of the book is the selecting the investors and managing your deal. So once you get an offer, is this a good offer? And then how do you negotiate that offer? And so a lot of the mistakes, I mean, there's mistakes across all three, but a lot of the mistakes that are harder to understand intuitively are the technical ones, which are in the third part of the book, right? Because investors do this every day. Founders maybe do it 3 times or 4 times in the life of a company. And so it's hard to make sure that you don't make those mistakes without having experienced them, right? And so we can focus on any one of those. Which one would you like?
I have questions on all of those.
All right,
I'll start with the mindset.
Yeah.
Is it something you have or you don't? Is it something you can learn?
Definitely can learn it. It's and we had to learn it at Seedcamp. So Reshma and I, over the course of the history of Seedcamp, we've raised now 6 funds, and we've gotten tons of rejections. And there was a point, and I can remember it vividly. There's a point when the rejections were personal, and then they stopped being personal, and they started becoming instructive. And now, whenever we get rejections, they're very instructive. They give me a sense for what could I have done differently, what could I have done better, what did they not like, what's different, what's changed, what's in the market, where are we off market. It's super helpful. So rejections now are super helpful. But I had to internalize that. You know, at early days, we felt it like a rejection of us as people. And I think that that's a transformation people need to make simply through acceptance to some extent, but also shifting the narrative in your brain. And part of shifting that narrative allows you to look at those rejections in more detail. Like, you know, when people get angry, like in video games, everything turns red. It's funny because I think when people get rejected, it's not that everything turns red, but like as a metaphor, it works well because it means that you shut down listening intently. But if I'm listening to somebody rejecting me, I can sometimes tell if the reason that they're telling me is the real reason. I can also tell if it's something I said versus something that was independent of me, you know?
Don't you tell them? I believe now. How old are you? Did I ask?
40. 46, sorry. 46.
46. So
Yeah.
I'm 2 years younger than you are.
Yeah.
So we're almost the same age. Maybe now because Seedcamp is bigger, maybe, I don't know. But at my age, when I feel that, most of the time I will tell it. I will say, you know what, I feel like this is not the reason. Would you give me the real reason? Am I wrong? Is that feeling wrong? And would you give me the real reason?
Yeah. I don't think that calling people out ever works. I don't think it ever works. I think you don't get very far in life by being super direct with people because the reality is that your perception of super direct isn't always accurate, right? Like, and I think as you mature in life, you realize that there's a lot of subjectivity to what you think is right and wrong.
I need 2 more years to mature.
Exactly.
At that point.
Yeah, but it's really tricky, right? Like, I mean, let's pick something random, like music. Is my choice of music objectively better than yours? No, it's subjective. Okay, well, I think we're comfortable with that, right? Socially speaking, everyone's comfortable with the fact that my music can be different than your music taste.
Sure.
And we're cool with that. Okay, so at what point does that subjectivity become objective, right? Like, well, it becomes objective when we feel something is factual. Like this desk is color yellow. And you say, well, no, it's colored
cream.
It's cream.
Yeah.
Well,
it's definitely cream.
Right, it's definitely cream. So, okay, we're getting close to something where we could potentially say is a factual thing. And then you have numbers, right? Like the speed of light. That's probably like a very factual thing. It would be very weird for us to disagree on that because that's something that's kind of a known thing, a known constant. But most of life doesn't operate in there. Like when I did my MBA, one of the things that we learned about was this idea of a discounted cash flow. And I remember graduating from the MBA thinking I could solve every problem with a discounted cash flow. And I have a section in the book about company valuations. And now I realize that even the whole premise of a discounted cash flow is absolute subjective. because there's an assumption about growth, and that assumption is subjective. And there's an extrapolation of that. And that extrapolation is based on current circumstances. And those current circumstances imply a certain rate of growth that is based on no change in the same team members. So imagine you had somebody who was a gifted creator in that company, but they were 65 and they were one year away from retirement. And the extrapolation on your DCF, future cash flows, meant that that creator is going to be building the same quality movies for that company for the next 20 years, but that person's going to be retired. So that company's not going to have that quality of creator in the company, and yet the discounted cash flow is built on that assumption, right? Take another example. One of the things that I find really interesting about the lack of correlation between sustainability and capitalism is this idea that, for example, a fishing company could go out to the ocean to capture fish, come back to the market, sell it, and that's the revenue per annum, and that you can extrapolate that next year you're going to grow, but you have no consideration for whether the fish are reproducing fast enough. And you could effectively fish to death, and there's no more fish for you to capture, but your DCF shows growth up and to the right, exponential, completely uncorrelated to how many fish are on the sea. And so they start getting to the fact that there is no objective truth to some of these things. That is not to say that there aren't things in life that can be objective, but a lot of things are kind of in this gray zone. So when you give somebody feedback on why you're turning down the company, especially at pre-seed and seed, it's very hard to be objective about something, be 100% certain that that's the reason why.
That was a question I wrote for later, but yeah, that's how big is the intuition?
How big is the intuition?
Yeah.
So, I'll answer that in a second. And so when you're rejecting it, was at the opposite end of intuition for investment. This is the intuition to say no, right? When you try to get somebody to give you an answer beyond what they give you, the best you can do is try to figure out whether what they're giving you is the truth or there's something else, whether or not it's all there or not, whether it's external or internal. And there's a lot of little things that you can deduce from that rejection, which help you improve, right? That's on a rejection. But my point, to answer your question, long story short, is that it's very hard to get the truth from somebody because there is very hard ways to do it. Now brings it to your question now, which is intuition. So intuition on investment, intuition is just another form of heuristic, right? All the things that I have experienced in my life make me believe in what you're about to do because of the things you showed me. If we go back to what we were talking about earlier, that people have expectations and emotions, and that's why they make these decisions. When I have intuition, all I have is a positive alignment of expectations and emotions. That's all it is, right? So if you're a founder, right, Matt, I'm going to invest in you. You and I feel like we get along. I feel like you're transparent with me. I trust you. So I feel like there's mutual kinship here. I believe that what you're telling me is the truth. Okay, we have an alignment in trust and emotion. Therefore, the other criteria, which is expectation, sits nicely into it because you're telling me that you're going to do well, and I believe you. And that's intuition. It's simple as that.
But if in all of this, you take the same thing, same math, same everything, and even you add that 10 other VCs, like the hottest in the place, want to invest in my company. So you got the FOMO also. Mm-hmm. And then at some point you look at me and you're like, you know what? There is something I just can't tell. But I even though he's cool, he's bright, sharp, everything I am, there is this little thing. And you will go to, I don't know, Sia, you will go to and say, I don't know, there is something, right?
Yeah.
Does that happen?
Yeah, of course it happens.
And you don't go?
Yeah, we sometimes we don't invest because of that. But that goes back to emotion, emotion plus expectation. All right, so to unpack your question, it means the expectations are probably aligned, like I believe what you're saying, but emotionally something's disconnected. And what's that emotion, right? It might be that, for example, this is a true story, but I won't be able to tell you the names because obviously,
I have another example after
obvious reasons. I think if I gave names, it would be not good. One of our companies that we invested in failed. And I was having a chat with an investor who passed on the company early in the journey of the company. In other words, this is like a retrospective.
Yeah. Post-mortem.
And I said, hey, why didn't you invest in this founder? And he said, well, I got the feeling that he was too academic. And that was it's a very interesting word. Too academic. That was a very interesting emotional assessment that this investor had of this person. So his intuition was, wow, really interesting, really smart, really capable. But he wasn't using the word academic in a good way, right? Because academic can be used good and bad, right? Like sure. It's not inherently a negative word. It's a neutral word, right? But the way he meant it was not startup friendly. And it was interesting. It was an interesting choice of word, right? He was saying, for some odd reason, this did not feel like it was going to be as fast. I think that's what he was trying to say. It's like, this was not as fast. And ironically, when you watch some videos like on Instagram that are action videos and the music that is paired with the video seems to match perfectly. Yeah. Sometimes words like that can match perfectly the outcome. And what happened when he said that to me in that postmortem, I was like, 100%.
Like the guy would only play by the book, right?
It was systematic, thoughtful, but not ultimately fast and out of the box.
Is postmortem something you do every time?
Not every time. I think sometimes you kind of know what's going to happen and it just happens, so there's no need. But when things catch you by surprise, it's worth sort of going into the postmortem and being like, that's strange. That's strange. Let's talk about it.
Getting back to the entrepreneur mindset, it's also a feeling, and I need to get your point of view on this, but I've seen entrepreneurs around me, I mean, probably not in the startup of fast-growing areas, but sometimes I just look at them, and it's not like, it's judgmental, probably it is, but who cares? I just feel they don't have this exact entrepreneur mindset. And what I'm saying is that each time, it's hard, they get some difficulties, they will go like, it's hard. And I mean, they're not fighters, they're not, I would say the lack of ambition sometimes, and sometimes I just want to tell them, I mean, I don't know, I don't know if it's the right say, praise yourself or just enjoy, even difficulties and all of those things. And I just feel that not everyone can even get there. Even some of my partners I had in the past, I've tried to elevate them or get them elevated by coaches or by some, but they wouldn't go there. There are some people who cannot have the entrepreneur mindset.
I agree with that. And it's tough, right? But I think there's a difference between you and me talking about not everyone can have the entrepreneur mindset, and we can agree on that, and that can be true. At the individual level, it's up to the individual whether they choose to do it or not. And so I think everyone has the individual capacity to choose to have that mindset, even if not everybody does.
Robert Plomin, you will listen to that podcast, you will say that's not true.
Yeah. And
it's in the DNA.
It could be in the DNA, and maybe, I don't have the PhD in this subject matter to have like, a rebuttal to him. But I think people ultimately always have a choice. I think I've met enough people in my life who have transformed their lives through choice to know that it's always there. So for example, I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily close friends with, but I do know firsthand a few people who have transformed themselves from a criminal lifestyle to a charitable lifestyle.
Yeah.
So I think if there's precedence of people transforming their lives all around the world, whether it's alcoholism or other things, it applies to everything. It's a choice. But let me let me address your point though in a different way as well though. So I've had the chance to speak to several people who work in the military in the Special Forces selection. And I've had this chat with 2 or 3 of them now. And it's really interesting because one of the things that they tell me is that it's not always clear who is going to be the one with the mindset. It doesn't, there was an interesting short video I saw on YouTube of this person who was being interviewed, who's an angel investor, and I forget her name, but she was saying that she doesn't invest in rich kids that with a pedigree because they've all been handed their life so easily that they have no
grit,
no grit to resolve. They haven't had to fight for things. She likes to back the under, and I think that that's a great story. But actually, from speaking to my friends who are in the Special Forces selection, they said that it didn't correlate where people came from. It was a choice, and that it was a choice in the specifics of Special Forces, right? Like, this is not entrepreneurship. It's a different thing, but it was a choice people would make. Like, I'm going to not quit, right? And that was the choices that they were making regardless of their background. And I think I sit more in that camp. I think it's a choice people make. And I think if you're listening to this and people tell you that you don't have the capabilities, you ultimately have to choose whether you disagree or agree with them.
Yeah.
And then shape your entire life around that. You know, do I want to believe that because somebody else told me that? Or do I want to accept a different choice for my life? And that's a hard thing.
And at the end, if you listen to Robert, that I highly recommend to the English-speaking listeners here, we kind of agree with him, because what he says is that deep down inside of you, in your guts, you know if you can do it and if you can't. And sometimes this intuition is, made of experience, but it's also you've experienced stuff that actually you're too small to be an NBA basketball player, right? Or, some things that even, you're too fragile, you're too emotional to do this and that and this. And so, and sometimes those things are in the DNA, but you know it deep down inside of you. So that's interesting. The next thing I had in question was really related actually to what you just said about this guy being too academic. Is on your part 2 preparation. What do you need? Sometimes, but the guy, the girl who will come to me with the perfect deck, the perfect thing, the perfect everything, kind of scares me. I like the guy who comes with, some actually thing deep down, like they have the idea, the drive, you feel the thing, and the whole preparation is not that good, but they come to you and say, look, I have this, we could do that, there is this, and probably sometimes they have a bit lack of organization, which can be a problem, but you can help them solve that. Do you see what I'm saying? What's your idea on that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Let me try to answer it by giving you an example from haute couture.
Yeah.
Like you go to Central St. Martin's, which is one of the schools here that teaches fashion. If you go to the New York Fashion Institute or any of these sort of fashion industries, you will look at things that look like they are made out of chaos. But that's by choice. Art in that rendition is by choice. Usually if you were to go to that artist and say, or that fashion, make me a traditional dress, they could do it. So they have the skills to do it, but they choose something different. And I think when you fundraise, if you think about your product, which is the fundraising product, and you think about it the way that you think as an artist with a record or a fashion designer with a dress or something, you have to think about it as something you prepared for, even if you choose to represent it differently. So the fact that you might have a preference for that, I totally get that. I don't even think you can be prescriptive. I don't try to be prescriptive in my book. I try to say, look, you can do whatever you want, but you have to have an idea of how much money you need. You have to have an idea of what your cap table looks like, because that's equivalent of somebody being a fashion designer, coming up with something cool, but not knowing how to do the basics.
Totally. Yeah.
So I think the fundraising materials aren't about having the perfect deck. It's about having the basics so that when you want to be artistic about what your deck looks like, so it stands out, so it makes the statement that you want, whatever shape it takes. You know, when I wrote the book the first time, people were sending around PowerPoints. Now people use DocSend.
Yeah.
Sometimes people had PDFs, you know, sometimes it doesn't really matter. But what you need to do is think about the recipient. And so the number one thing that I recommend is think about the person who's receiving this. What is the workflow that they need to go through to consume this? So for example, imagine if you were super creative with your deck and everything was really cool, but it required 5 downloads before there was a conversion event. It just wouldn't happen,
No.
right? Whereas if there's a workflow where there's a simple email, right? And that simple email isn't a big cognitive leap. People are like, oh, that sounds cool. Let me learn more. Then there's a demo or there's a deck or whatever. It doesn't matter what it is, but there's a sequential stacking of things that increase the interest level that usually converts better. So in the book, I don't try to say be prescriptive. I give examples because some people, you know, when you write a book, you have to write it for a broad audience, right? Like,
Sure.
I wish I could know everybody who's reading it and then I would calibrate which chapters to read, right? But for some people, they don't even know what a fundraising deck looks like. So I share some examples and that's cool. But some people that are very good, like think about a fashion person who's very good at sewing. You can experiment with different materials. You can experiment with, and you can do whatever you want. And so that's where people can showcase things in a way that is unique to them, their style, the type of company. And of course, it has to be relevant to the type of company. For example, if you're building we're investors in a company called Julie and Bruno. It's a vegan cheese company.
Okay, yeah.
And the founders are very into food. So it's a very graphical pitch deck, lots of imagery, because ultimately it's a product that you need to taste to really understand. So the next best thing is how it looks, because we all know that looks and taste are somewhat correlated, and smell, but you can't smell a pitch deck. So you've removed 2 senses, right?
Yeah.
So now it's how it looks. And so they had to put a lot of creativity into how it looked. So that deck is going to look very different than an enterprise software sales enablement tool, where it might just be numbers. How many licenses, how many. So I think you need to think differently. That whole chapter is thinking differently about what kind of company you are, what kind of things you need, and being aware that there's basics you cannot get away from. You need a cap table. You need a financial plan. You need awareness of how you're going to spend the money, what you're going to do, what your milestones are. Those things kind of are basics.
Even though it's not going to be true.
Even though it's not going to be true, because I think it helps people understand what could be true.
Okay.
You know, like I think every single moment that you plan something is a moment when you open up to the possibility of what could happen, good and bad, and you at least have an assessment of how to manage it. If you don't go through that exercise, you're really ultimately guessing. And there's a difference between pivoting left and right 10 degrees, 15 degrees, and doing 180 degrees every quarter.
Yeah.
So it's useful to have some sense of direction, even if there's flexibility there.
I get it. Yeah, I get it. And I've seen and I've invested in some people playing totally by the playbook, and you know, each stage you describe maybe the email, the deck, the proof of concept, the video you had, and each time you're like, wow, I like this. They just, you know, put a yes in your mind, and you go to the next yes, and at the end it cannot be anything else but a yes. And I've seen also, I mean, I've made great investments in a loop of WhatsApp messages where you had probably too much FOMO, but still it worked and it was a good investment.
But it's
because
also,
you were like, yeah, the team is good, the dude is good, the whole idea is interesting.
Yeah.
It's going to go fast. I trust them. I mean, boom. Yeah.
But it also depends on the time. Like, for example, let's say you were getting that WhatsApp back and forth when you had 10 other WhatsApps going on the same. Your sense of urgency declines based upon the level of competitiveness.
Yeah.
So that's why it's hard to sometimes have a strategy that works all the time, because that strategy was designed around the times we live in. And those times change. So today, that sort of fake FOMO doesn't work when there's a lot of companies that were trying to do that. And, now there's just hard to do that unless you're like in the 1% of AI companies. Yeah. Other than that, people can tell you're faking it.
Speaking of AI, I was hesitating to go into the selecting investors. Maybe we'll get back to that point if we get the time later on. Speaking of AI, you spoke about quantum a bit. There are new breakthroughs, right? I mean, especially since OpenAI Midjourney came along at the end of 2022. And we see how big it is, like every day. Like, it's not like it's going to be. It's today, it's already here, right? And it's going to be also bigger. What has it changed? What is it? Where are you right now into this? I mean, it seems like a year ago, we would think it's 5 years away from now. I don't know if maybe I was a bit late, but and now it's here. What did it change? What does it change now?
Yeah, I mean, the topic of AI, I'm sure, is one that everyone who's listening to this podcast has probably heard in 500 other podcasts, recently. Yeah. So maybe what I'll do is I'll share a little bit kind of where we are in our investment decisions on AI. We've been investing in AI now for about 6 years. Like, that's when I started seeing decks and at the time it was machine learning, really.
Yeah.
And that's evolved over the years and, of course, accelerated since GPT-3 and onwards. And what's really changed is the overall tolerance of companies to try and incorporate AI in some form of their operations. So tolerance. The other one is expectation on utility has gone up, because you can have somebody who's not even technological go to ChatGPT, do anything, and out comes something that looks like magic. Yeah. So now you expect that in your emails, in your operations, and other things. So I think the customer's perception of AI has now distributed much more broadly than it did 5-6 years ago. So those two things alone have made the bar of expectation for everybody in every organization to go up with what AI in the companies could look like. So that's kind of the context of why it's accelerated and why everyone's thinking about, well, how can I use this? How can I use this? How can I use this? So as an investor, where we're asking ourselves is, what are the areas where this is likely to work and the areas where it's likely not to work? Because there's a few things that we're seeing develop. One of them is anybody who has access to private data is an interesting investment opportunity, because the data training is a huge part of what makes it magical. And if you have access to data and have a LLM that leverages that data in a way that public-facing LLMs cannot, you now have a uniquely interesting proposition to offer to a set of customers that currently don't have access to that. So I'm going to take one that doesn't exist. Yeah, like health, for example. Matt was just showing me his Garmin. It's like, if you have all the data of all your customers' heart rates for the last 10 years, you can do a lot of interesting things with that nobody else can do. If Garmin or any company that was leveraging that data...
You got Whoop or anyone... Yeah,
if they were fundraising right now, I would be all over that. And not, I think a lot of people probably passed on Whoop when it first raising, the hardware, it's hard, blah, blah, blah. But it's... With a lot of private data, you can do a lot of interesting things.
A lot, yeah.
And so I think that's the number one valuable thing, because
Private data.
Because anything that's public facing is already miles ahead, like OpenAI is miles ahead over anybody else on public facing data. It's incredibly hard. So that's the next thing, which is we're looking at companies that leverage and integrate OpenAI's tech into verticals. And that's cool. You know, like they have a API that you can integrate and build companies with. And there's tons of companies out there who can benefit from this. But the biggest thing I'm worried about there is, you know, Microsoft has been doing an amazing job of building out their Copilot product and selling enterprise customers. And I've been having a chat with my friends who are like in large companies, and they're all just waiting for Microsoft feature sets to be rolled out, because then they don't have to worry about the procurement of an external service provider with ambiguous, you know, user rights and geography and stuff. So they can just, nobody got fired for buying Microsoft, right? And so the big challenge that I have is, yes, these vertical applications of AI can be amazing, but there is already some level of pressure coming in from the Microsofts of the world who have access to these customers and probably have locked them up. So there's some opportunities there where there's probably nobody in between, somebody who hasn't tackled this. And we've invested in a few companies that are doing that. For example, we've recently done one that does autism detection in children. We have another one that is helping the real estate industry speed up its documentation by aggregating and analyzing all the different documentation across a transaction and summarizing it for the sake of creating marketing materials or completion documentation. We have another one that has to do with the analysis of conversations with people and who they might be for hiring or for defense purposes. And so all these are vertical applications of technology that may have been built by somebody else, but integrated and deployed in a vertical setting can generate quite a bit. So that's the second bit, right? The third bit where we're most cautious is anything that is in the creative or educational space. And that's because that's where Midjourney and a lot of other tools like it are already miles ahead. Leveraging large libraries of images or large libraries of training of public information to generate something that's pretty good. So education, for example, a lot of educational materials is publicly available. Like if you look at most of history, math, all the subjects, they're all largely public information. So it's not too hard to tailor something for education, and therefore having a competitive edge becomes difficult. And the same thing for creative. We have made an investment in a private data-driven generative AI creative solution. But again, it's because the intellectual property is private. But anything that's public facing, it gets hard because other people have that. And I suspect what's going to happen is a lot of these intellectual property owners are going to start developing their own Gen AI, and you'll just have another revenue stream.
If I want to ask the question on another way, does every would probably be no, but company that applies to Seedcamp now, as they're in the tech area, must have a kind of AI approach. I mean, at least a good understanding on how it would change their business. I mean, is it
100%?
Yeah.
I think I could probably say that that's the case for many funds now. It's that you either need to know how AI is going to affect you, or you're already using it in some capacity.
Okay.
Which begs the question, is investing in AI really a thing? Or is it part of it's like saying investing in mobile.
Yeah.
Like you don't say that anymore.
Yeah, sure.
It was a thing back in the early days, but now everything has a mobile reactive element to it, right? Whereas AI is still kind of in this weird zone where a lot of tools are still being built. But in other cases, it's just a component of a company. Like some element of the company might be AI. It doesn't mean it's an AI company. It just means some component of it is affected by or empowered by AI. And I think that's the norm now. But not every company is like that, but a lot of them are.
And so if I go 2 or 3 years back in the past, do you have, or 1 year? I mean, some more recent that were not in that configuration, or do you have to push some of them to say, look, guys, I mean, be aware. I mean, even if it was 6 months ago, 3 months ago, but like things are changing. You really, really, really have to dig into that, because otherwise it's going to be difficult.
I only did that with one.
Okay.
And it wasn't even the way that you described it. It was like, hey, by the way, I'm curious what you're doing with regards to this, because it seems like something that would affect you. And the founders are like, yep, we're on it. Yep.
Okay.
You know, I think most people are so aware of this that I don't think a single person has ever said to me, like, I'm not worried about that, or I'm not thinking about that. Every conversation I've had, somebody's always had a reaction. Now, the urgency of that reaction isn't always the same.
Yeah.
But everyone's been like, yeah. I'm thinking about it. I'm integrating it. It's just too big to ignore.
I think the hard part was, I run, my partner Laurent runs, he's the CEO, I'm now the president, but we have a digital agency. We're about 100 people. We do consulting, we do dev, we do UX, UI, pretty good in those areas. I mean, and a lot of also content creation for major clients worldwide. But all of these things, I mean, consulting, coding, UI, UX, wow, and I think it was hard to push that internally. I mean, I've been really, really every day. I mean, at some point, I think they were all laughing at me, but it was hard because some of them didn't buy it that much at the beginning. Some of them were scared, obviously, and I think it was. I think we're passing it right now, but yeah, I don't know if you felt that. Do you use it at Seedcamp?
I use it for tons of stuff. We have Notion. It has an AI component. Yeah. I use Superhuman for email.
Are you satisfied with Notion's AI?
It's okay. It's good for like structuring things. Like I think we forget how many things are just repetitive, right? Like recently I had to write an agenda for an event that we're hosting. I just told ChatGPT, like, give me an agenda, space it out, starting at 11, ending at 6:30, spacing it out 45 minutes per speaker, and then build some buffer time for this and that. And like little parameters like that, it spit it out, copy, paste. And like, I would have had to do that manually. So like, yeah. I mean, I use it all the time, but Sia, who those that are listening to us probably heard his interview, he uses it for research sometimes.
Yeah.
So people use it across the organization for different things.
Did you develop some stuff around AI yet? I mean,
not yet. I mean, it's something that we've been trying to figure out what kind of thing we could develop. And it's an interesting one, right? Because if we go back to what we were talking earlier about how hard pre-seed and seed is to extrapolate, it's very hard to look at our data and extrapolate and say, these companies are going to succeed. These ones are not. Everything moves too fast to look at our historical data and extrapolate what will be successful. So the only things that I think AI could help us with is generating reports,
definitely.
like whether it be investor reports or something. So I think from an operations efficiency point of view, that's probably where we're going to use AI. Like if you visit Carlos 5 years from now in the future, I probably would say that I see AI implemented mostly in all the efficiency gain part of the operations. In terms of like predicting the future side of things, I don't think so.
Yeah. But when I think about your thing around private data, my interpretation for a company like Cosa Vostra is mainly that we have a knowledge, we have skills, we have emails, we have notions, we have a lot of things we've done in the past, we know how to do. And for proposals for clients when you come back from a meeting. I would love to be able to just put like all of the notes saying, here is what I see we could do. What am I missing? Can you check on everything we've done? What we can do well, And I think we're digging into that. That was the question why the reason why I was asking about Notion, if it's good or not, because the problem we have is to connect all of those things with an AI.
Yeah.
Because it's
and that's the issue, is that right now there is no meta aggregator for all this stuff, but it's partially because it's first party data. Notion owns the data that you've put into it, and it isn't sharing that data with Google, so that you can't use Google Bard to source your Notion data to then organize everything around Bard's output or OpenAI. So like, but that's just the nature of how things are. I mean, we've known this for years.
I loved a recent discussion I have with an entrepreneur on Génération like yourself called Paul Mougineau. This guy is amazing. He's also an artist, and he's got an artist that's called Horace Vécrier. He's sold art pieces to like world famous collectionists. I mean, it's interesting. And Paul, in a conference we did recently around AI and M&A, at the end, the conclusion was deal with your own data before dealing with other people's data.
Yeah.
And I think it was the best advice I had recently. You have to aggregate, to get your data sort.
Yeah.
And that links to what you said. I mean,
and many companies didn't think about the world that we live in today when they organize their data. I mean, we haven't, and we're in tech, right? Like some of our data's in Google Docs, and some's in Google Sheets, and some is in Airtable, and how the hell do you rectify that?
Yeah.
How do you normalize that? How do you reorganize that? And so that's a big project that we're working on right now, is how do you do that?
Yeah.
But even then, like, I think if anything, one thing that's really funny about what this world that we live in right now with prompt engineering, is that it's making you rethink language, right? Because like part of what prompt engineering is language. It's delegation. It's precision of delegation. And that's something that now is called prompt engineering, but back in the day it used to be called leadership or management. It's please like write a message in the tone of X that addresses the issue of Y from the point of view of L. That's understanding the social hierarchy of the person, understanding with empathy the tone you want to have, the outcome you want to have. Like it's really interesting to see how much it's made us aware of all the elements of language and communication and teamwork and delegation, because that's what it is. Prompt engineering is just
definitely
the aggregation of all that stuff.
What I like into this and into what you say is it puts words on thing I've felt is like, those people who, when you're working on the logo or something and they just say, no, I don't like it. And you're like, okay, great. Be more constructive, please. And if you work with that, with those guys, when you put them in front of ChatGPT, they're like, no, this is a piece of shit. It doesn't work. And you're like, no, think again, mate.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And we'll see that evolve. And I think if I have to look at if I look at the world that's utopia and dystopian, the dystopian world would say that anybody who's really good at writing is not going to have a job because AI is going to do the writing for them. The utopian world is we're going to get more precise about how we write. Like the elements that make writing hard are going to go away, like spelling, grammar, run-on sentences, punctuation. Those things are going to go away because the AI is going to sort that out. But the intentions, the empathy, the precision, the emotional connection, the structure, the workflow, the layering, the lead up, the storytelling, the circularity, all those elements of communication that are critical, we might get better at them because we have a tool that helps us with it.
I'm trying to get... we will require more, in French we say exigence, but we will want something more. Yeah, the expectation will be higher probably. Much higher, because you don't want something that is not really well written, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also for analytics, like for example, my father is very gifted with mathematics.
Yeah.
He can do math in his head very fast. And when I was growing up, he would always ask me these questions and I sucked at it. And it would make me really insecure because I needed a calculator. And then I discovered Excel, right? Because Excel is something that we all got used to in my age group, and early in our careers. And I discovered that I'm actually not bad at math. I just need to see the logic in a spreadsheet. And my Excel sheets are much nicer than my dad's, right? And he's still doing math in his head. So it's funny how a new generation's tool set makes the previous generation's capabilities obsolete. And so if I look at what we deem as a necessity today, maybe in the future, yes, maybe in the future, people and future employees and leaders won't be able to do some of the things that we can do right now, writing long form by hand, whatever. But their ability to convey complex ideas more succinctly and more stacked is going to be better because they understand what they want to do and they have the machine help them do it rather than having to spend years honing it. Like you're a podcaster. It's taken me 150 episodes to figure out how to have a conversation flow a certain way in a podcast. The first 100 episodes were very robotic in some ways. Whereas if you have an AI helping you, I've actually sometimes asked the AI, like based upon what you know of this person from the publicly facing information, what are the questions you would ask?
Sure.
And then I take those and I think, that's not high energy. There's not, it's funny, right? It's funny what we can do now. I still need to be decent at managing the conversation and the tempo. The AI is not going to do that for me because it's intrinsically a human interaction, but the tool has made it a lot better.
Yeah, it's so dizzy. I mean, it's amazing because what you just said, like probably within some years, people won't be able to write long forms. Yeah, okay. And we're not able to do things that people were able to do like 50 years ago or 200 years ago anymore, right? Yeah. And it's probably things we don't miss really.
Yeah. Look at Beethoven, right? Yeah. Like, I sometimes look at some of the classical works of music and I think, wow, like this is complex. Like, where's there's like an infinite series of digressions from a theme melodically and rhythmically. And yet the audience would have perceived it as a cohesive work. Whereas we're used to tracks, like track 1, track 2, track 3, 10 tracks in a record. And then there's a beat, the beat drops in, and all that stuff, right? We're used to these things. And then when we listen to classical music, we're like, what?
Loops
what is this?
And so on, yeah, like
exactly.
There's no loop.
But at the same time, even within the context of our current music, we appreciate some really complex, like what Daft Punk did, right? Like Daft Punk invented a whole new genre of like layering and synth and like samples and looping. And there was somebody who like took apart 5 different tracks that were inspired for one Daft Punk loop. And that's the complexity that we're capable of now. But we've lost the appreciation for the previous way of doing music. And I think the same thing's probably going to happen with creativity. Like there's a couple of companies that I see now advertising entirely AI generated versions of their product for photography.
Yeah.
Like why have to hire lighting and setting and all this stuff when you can just generate your product on a hill in Scotland with the wind blowing and a horse in the background and the model looking like they are, exactly, yeah.
That's something I'm showing Carlos a picture of this guy. I wanted to illustrate the burnout.
Yeah.
And so I just asked Midjourney, I want this guy in a room from the back, a picture like in an artistic black and white photography.
Yeah.
With how do you call that? Fog around.
Yeah, fog.
I want a lot of objects in the room, and it has to be dark. And how could I get that picture? I mean, literally, how much would it cost me? There is no way you would do that naturally now. It's over.
Yeah, and this brings us to a philosophical discussion point about what is the human experience, and is AI as a technology going to enable us to wipe out the human experience, or to be able to communicate it better? That image that you showed me, which hopefully you'll share on the show notes.
Yeah.
For people to see, like it's probably a very good, quick relative to maybe what a Van Gogh would have done, right? but a very quick representation of an emotion, what it feels like to have burned out. And if you're trying to convey to people emotions, which is how we communicate, sometimes words aren't accurate enough. This is why GIFs are so useful, right?
Yeah.
I love GIFs because sometimes you can convey an emotion much easier than you can with words.
Yeah.
And so with AI, now you can capture that even more succinctly. And I think it opens up a whole new range of possibilities for humanity to communicate and get to know each other. But where it gets dangerous is that it can also make things worse.
True.
By implanting ideas or augmenting fear. And so we're gonna be, you and I are gonna live through a very interesting phase of humanity where we're gonna have to reconcile our inherent capabilities through technology with our inherent flaws as a species.
And you and I have responsibilities around that. I mean, around your contents, my contents, your financing. Also, I think it's quite interesting to know what we want, where we want to go around that.
Yeah.
I have so many things to say around that. I've lost because I was so much into what you just said.
If we look at,
yeah, I know where I was. I wanted to talk about your podcast and creators economy, but okay. I'll get there after.
Yeah, no, but if I just pick up the thread from where you left it, is like as we have this increasing power to be able to generate change and amplification. I think the biggest challenge that we're going to have is how do we use that in subjects that are super complex, that to date we haven't had any major progress in making exponential change in. Like climate change is one of them and health is another. I think that's where I'm kind of curious to see what happens, because I feel like when it comes to media, art, music, film, all those areas, we can kind of see what's going to happen within a year. Like it's already happening. That's why you see, as of this podcast, you see strikes going on about
of course,
intellectual property, right? Yeah. We know that that's going to end up in utopia or dystopia within the end of the year, right? But what we don't know yet is whether or not we're going to have some of the promise, some of the hope that comes from solving some of the biggest health problems and some of the biggest climate problems through these tools. And that's kind of maybe where, we still have, that book has yet to be written, how that's going to play out.
And I don't know how big it is here, but I feel that in France particularly, there is it's like there is team A, team B, right? I mean, and for most of the people, if you're like in the climate team, you just hate all of that shit. I mean, it's just it's not going to happen. It's not going to help, and I kind of reject that. I mean, I to me there is that's at some point probably the only hope we have at some point, right? Sure, we can. I mean, not take a plane or 2 or 10 or 100 or any more at all, but at some point. You see in health, I mean, it's already happening in health, I think. I mean, in cancer research and I think it's already happening. There's a couple of companies in France that are already working very well around AI, I think. Probably you know more about me. Let's get, before we wrap it up, can
I comment on that last one?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I think this comment probably applies to multiple things that we've been discussing, which is whether it be solving climate crisis or solving any kind of major issue that we face, is that not all problems have immediate solutions. And I think with the speed of technology and the speed of media and the speed of communication in the last decade going so fast with social media, we've lost patience for long-term thinking. And the hard part that we have as investors and as inventors and as creators, and the biggest challenge we're going to have is resetting people's mindsets to think long term. Because you can look at something like climate, for example, And on the one extreme, you have people who want the entire oil industry to stop now.
Yep.
Because that, as well intended as it might be, in their view, would stop the climate crisis now. The reality is, even if you did that, it's already got momentum in one direction, and it's going to manifest itself in one direction. The problem with that specific desire, whether it's done through technology or not, is that it has a knock-on effect on so many industries that people are not willing to give up. So, for example, if somebody had a colonoscopy or a endoscopic surgery or any kind of health treatment in the last decade plus, they're probably using some product that's made out of plastic. That product that's made out of plastic, whether it's a syringe or something else, is made from the oil industry. You cannot stop one without stopping the other. The two things are connected. If you look at farming and the way that nitrates are produced, it requires the oil industry. If you look at sustainable energy sources like windmills and solar panels, it requires some elements of the oil industry to either transport it there or to create it in the supply chain. And so the thing is that you need to have, we need to collectively think about our problems in a long-term, medium-term, and short-term basis. And that's really hard. And we want everything to be now, whether that's health or not. But there's two ways of issuing. One is patience for the long term, but also patience for the slowness that sometimes needs to happen. We all want health to go faster, but would we really be comfortable with some startup that we don't necessarily trust? And I trust in startups, right? I invest in, but do I necessarily know if that startup's going to be around to deal with my data in an ethical way when it's my health data? No. So there's going to be some caution that the National Health Services need to have in interfacing with startup data and vice versa, right? And so that's the problem, is that we need to look at all these major problems with some sort of near, mid, and late discovery and implementation. And we've lost patience. As a civilization, we've lost patience with that. And unfortunately, some of the biggest problems we have yet to solve are going to require that.
And I think all of the questions around what you're saying right now are so deep and so unresolved. And I mean, if I ask you, or if I ask many people, are you ready to have a chip underneath your, I don't know, wherever skin? I mean, most of people will say no, obviously not, if I can get. And if I just ask them, but you have an Apple Watch, you have a Garmin, you have,
you have a chip on top of your skin.
Yeah, it's the same thing. You give all that data already. Obviously, are you ready to have your brain connected to Google and to go faster and think faster? I mean, you would say no, but if like 10 people around you has it, and they go just 10 times faster, you're like, and all of these things are probably going to happen, or unless we don't want them to, or we forbid them. But if we forbid them in Europe or in the US, they will be allowed in China. So that's deep.
It is. And this is, if I go back to the example of climate, we're a big climate investor. We love to invest in the segment, and it's really important segment that we should invest in. But it's calibrating between like what is just impulse and what is actually real. Like impulse would be like, to your example, we should have our brains connected straight into the cloud because it's the really cool thing to do. But the realistic thing is that maybe we don't need that. Maybe what we do that is only for entertainment once a week. And this is why like Google Glass, for example, kind of failed, was because the premise behind Google Glass was that we were going to be okay with having a conversation with somebody and they have the little thing looking at me and then looking at you and looking at me and looking at the display. It just wasn't socially acceptable. And I don't know that even if today that technology had worked, whether we would accept it, right? And so I think the idea of something sometimes requires evolution beyond its original conception. And so I think with climate and with other these things, it's sometimes we have the right intentions, but we just need to let technology and society develop how to best integrate that, So I see a future where, for example, realistically speaking, with, let's say, cars, I could very easily see a future where there's a hybrid set of technologies that power cars 20 years in the future. It's not just all battery. It might be some sort of like green hydrogen. It might be some sort of, and there's a reason why, there's a reason why it has to do with the power density of batteries and other things. But, maybe until that technology with power density of batteries changes, then it's a hybrid technology. And so this is why it's sometimes rushing things isn't necessarily always the best thing. And sometimes it does take time, even if you have the best intentions. True.
So this time, before we close, I think it's very interesting. I could spend hours talking about it, but you have your own podcast.
Yep.
It's actually how many you say episode did you have?
I lost track. I think I'm over 350 now. I don't know. You probably have it right in front of you. So you can probably tell me exactly how many.
I was actually. So we're more or less the same.
Really?
Because where is it? I have it somewhere. Here, this much I know the Seedcamp podcast. Carlos Espinal.
On SoundCloud, it probably says it.
Oh, on SoundCloud. Okay, I'm going on Apple Podcast.
Yeah.
But so we're more or less the same. I'm around 350.
Yeah, that's my guess.
Actually, I don't have. Yeah, I don't have the numbers. Well, whatever. It's around that.
Yeah.
So you have. You understand, I believe, the creators economy quite well now. All of those guys you listen to, probably also other podcasters in the US or in here the Knowledge Project, maybe guys like Tim Ferriss and so on. What are your? Have you ever invested in some? That's a personal question, maybe for some of our auditors, but I'm trying to build up things around that. I have the podcast, and then I'm trying to build up businesses around those, and it's kind of a work in progress. I'm having a lot of fun, and I think people around me are having a lot of fun because I get investors coming from those podcasts and partners, co-founders, and so on, clients, and I think it's a new era we're building.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on it? What are you doing? How are you investing? What are your ideas on the creators economy?
Yeah, so creator economy is something that we have looked at in the past. We invested in a company called Opinion back in the day, and I think that a lot of times, first of all, you have to define it. Like we're investors in a company called Maze, and that's kind of like a specific kind of creator and design process. So creator economy is broad, right? Like whether it's visual or whether it's audio or, and different ones have different levels of value. So for example, with podcasting, it's been a very difficult sector to monetize. Unless you're a Joe Rogan or one of these guys that gets acquired as a show, Tim Ferriss, it's very difficult to really generate enough revenue there. We've looked at a couple of tools that helped with audio and podcasting and editing, and they've all been okay.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the investment that we did called Opinion didn't work out, but it was a great thing. I'm trying to find. I'm on SoundCloud here to see if I can tell you exactly how many we've done. But when you start looking at other things in the creator economy, like Rayon or a couple of other companies that help complex parts of creativity, that's where we're really interested, because there's a lot of elements of the editing or of the creation where when you can make something better than what a traditional workflow could be, that's where there's an opportunity. So there's a famous company in France that you probably know because they're part of like that sort of established mafia, was called Stupeflix.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And everybody knows the founder, and that GoPro acquired it, and it now is the foundation. One of the things that made it so wonderful was that it helped the quick editing of videos into something
big pain.
That's dynamic. So that's an example of creator economy investment where I think it's like 1 + 1 = 5, right? Like the magic that came out the other end was so amazing that it totally justified that, right? Whereas when it's just like data capture or basic elements of the supply chain. We've passed on a few that were just simply like content marketplaces. It just became harder for it to like steer away from existing players who own that space.
Would there be any way to invest in creators themselves?
If you look at creators, that word's too broad.
Yeah,
because
probably.
if you say, for example, a creator is a musician, then that's called being a record label. If that creator is a movie director, then that's a Netflix. If that creator is a podcaster, again, it's more of a studio model. If that creator is a game designer, it's a game studio. And we have invested in a game studio. The game is called Fate's World. You should check it out. It's amazing. FATES World.
Fates.world.
Yeah. It's amazing. Beautiful game. And we'll do that. Yeah, sure. But that's just investing in the outcome. But in venture capital, we're not really set up to be movie producers. So I can't be doing movies. I can't be doing artists that make music. I can't be doing podcasters. A game is slightly different in the sense that you can have multiple games, so you become a studio, right? So that can be kind of a venture capital investment because there's technology that generates the games. But creators are not natural fit for venture capital. They have their own industries, producers in movies, producers in other areas.
Sometimes I feel, why did I ask this question so that you understand and everybody understands? That if, I mean, for example, I told you, we have this company called Cosa Vostra. We've created a multi-channel network around creators called Orso Media. So we have a lot of creators around us, studios in Paris, and I'd like to invest massively in studios actually, because I know we could do much better and much more audience and much more money. We do quite good in monetization of podcasts, but it's not something we could scale to billions. So I get your point, but these influence or these communities we create, we manage to activate them through business creations. I mean, startups somehow. We created last year Alvo.market, which is a marketplace to buy and sell businesses, right? So we aim to become one of the leaders or the leader in Europe at first to buy and sell small cap businesses, M&A. We're thinking about my second podcast called La Martingale, Personal Finances. We're working on the creation of a kind of I hate saying that, but TripAdvisor for personal finance. So how is this found? What are the commissions? What is the performance? This consultant, this bank, and so on and so on. And so we have many ideas. And I feel sometimes if we had, 50 million or 15 millions in front of us to go faster, that would be amazing.
But that's a form of venture builder, right? That what you're describing is a model that BetaWorks invented in the States, and you can just come up with stuff. You're effectively a fund. You could raise money for the idea of generating ideas that takes creators and builds stuff and then spins them out, and you have an equity ownership in that, and then that is your portfolio. You've built your own portfolio, right? And maybe it's what's going to happen. Like I think these ideas come in cycles, right? Like maybe right now there's so much creativity that's being unlocked with AI that there's a new generation of venture studios, and what you're describing is a venture studio of sorts, right?
Yeah.
So it's entirely possible, right? That no one idea is the one that drives it, but the collection of them is actually quite good. CAA, the largest artist agency, has something called CAA Labs, and that's what they do. They have all these people. So you want to build a startup with intellectual property from Tom Hanks? Great, here you go. And so
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, I don't know if the Hanks one is through CAA Labs, but that's just an example, right? So it just gives you an idea of of what's possible if you have the capacity to build from within. And it sounds like you do.
Yeah.
And so that's more about raising money as a fund than it is raising money from a VC. So that, to me, that smells more like you would be a fund.
Interesting.
That funds its projects. And then externally, VCs fund those projects to grow versus you as a company.
Yeah. It's kind of what we're doing. Yeah. We're financing them ourselves. But yeah, interesting. Thanks for that. Is there a question you would have loved me to ask?
I mean, I think that we covered AI, we covered climate and health. I think one of the topics we didn't really go into is cybersecurity, and the world we live in. And I think maybe just to comment on that briefly, it's we work with many different types of founders, and one of the sectors that we actively working on is cybersecurity. And what's clear is that the world's an increasingly fragile place, right? With a lot more division, and we're going through a very big transformation. And I think that what's really interesting for me is to see how founders are drivers in being part of that solution. Whether, the number of companies that I'm seeing that are trying to tackle fake news, that's encouraging, right? So what's interesting is that our industry is trying to solve some of those big problems. But it's also interesting that some of those threats are more and more amplified through technologies like AI.
Yeah.
And so, cybersecurity being one of them, where we are actively looking for investments that can help with how to address those challenges. Supply chain and logistics is another one, where you see how the world is affected by grain exports being blocked or supply chain of chips being affected. And what does that mean in terms of having to rethink our supply chains for hardware or for food or for, other elements, medicines? And so I think that's probably the biggest remaining opportunity to discuss, not necessarily for the rest of the show, but just for everyone and founders to contemplate, is like, I wouldn't doubt it if the next set of opportunities that I saw were around how AI helps solve those problems quicker.
Yeah, I think I haven't treated these ones enough on my podcast, so I'll do that. That's a good idea. Is there a question you would have hated me to ask? Caution, you know what's going to be the next one.
Yeah. I mean, it's not as much as a question, but it just popped in my head when you said that. It's like, I think everyone in our industry is going to go through a very low point in their lives. And, I think we all have anecdotes about the low points of our lives, whether it was a rejection in a fundraise. And I've had several in my career at Seedcamp. And I think the lowest point that I've had, and I just share this because I skip you having asked me the question. The lowest point I had in my life was when I didn't have the courage to ask the person what their intentions were when I heard something about what they were doing. What was happening was that I thought that this other person was trying to do something to screw us. And I think the series of conversations that number of people involved could have been a lot simpler if I had just had the courage to call them up and be like, hey man, I heard you are doing this. Is that true? And I think that the scariest thing, getting asked when you're in a podcast or anything like that is like, what's the ultimate low point that you've had? Because you got to relive it to some extent. And for me, that's probably the lowest point in my career was that when I had that pop up. And I remember feeling, because the guy, because I avoided it, the guy got really upset because he thought that, he thought something that hadn't happened. And he was really upset at me, called me up, was really angry, and I had to apologize. And when I unpacked the whole situation, it was simply because I didn't pick up the phone and say, hey man, I heard you're trying to do something that isn't right. And rather than me being defensive, there I would have been empathetic.
Interesting.
And whereas instead I was defensive. If I had been empathetic, I would have avoided the whole thing. And sometimes we're in situations where you just need to have a very difficult conversation with somebody. You know, if you're a founder with your investors, say, hey, look, company's not doing well. I need to do this. Can you help me? And you have to be open to the fact that the investor is going to say, no, I'm not going to help you. And that's painful. And sometimes it's easy to just pretend everything's fine. You know, that's from the founder point of view. From the investor point of view, it could be avoiding having a tough conversation with the founder and being like, you're off the rails, because you don't want to make that awkward. It's hard. And you have to think about what you're going to say. But I think that's probably the biggest lesson that I've had is it's hard, but sometimes you just need to have those hard conversations.
If I would record another podcast with you, I would go into that. And I would go also into the way you talk to your investors on the long run. I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
The reports you get. I try to be as, I don't know if you think it's good or not actually, but as transparent as I can, and just start with the bad and ugly news. So I try to just at least show that I'm aware.
Yeah.
And that we're going to fix those things. Yeah. And if I put them month after month, and if I put them again, then it's going to be a problem.
Yeah,
so I'm trying to fix them really, you know.
Yeah.
But I find it hard, and sometimes I get annoyed in companies I've invested in where I don't see the problems, or I know there are problems that are not in the reports.
Yeah,
that's terrible.
It's tough, but it's also a calibration exercise. It's the depth. It's a like what is important, what isn't. There's a lot of little decisions that you need to make, and sometimes I get it. Like I get it. It's not always easy to calibrate, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. That's my point there. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try.
Thank you for that. Where do we follow you? We can go on LinkedIn, probably.
Yes.
You publish on LinkedIn.
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter at CEE. The book is called The Fundraising Field Guide.
I'll put the link, obviously, the link to the podcast. This much I know, the Seedcamp podcast.
And my long-form blog posts are on Medium.
Yeah.
Medium, or you can go carlosespinal.com.
Yeah. Okay.
It just redirects to Medium. So, and the book is going to be coming out in the later half of this year, the new version. So yeah, stay tuned for that. It just covers some of the things we discussed.
Cool. I have a couple of questions, but before I have to apologize for one thing.
Uh-oh.
Yesterday, when I talked to Sia, I was laughing at you because I was expecting you to have a strong accent, because most of the Spanish origin, I mean, you know what?
Oh, really?
Yeah, their English accent is really, really terrible. So how comes? So I apologize first. I was saying anyway. It's in French. He will not listen to this podcast until here, so it's okay. I can talk shit.
Yeah.
But and I see my English accent is much worse than yours. So how comes you speak such a good English?
I mean, I think when you grow up in Latin America and you get exposed to, you know, TV, and I went to school, I went to university in the States.
Okay.
But I mean, when I do remember having an accent.
Yeah, okay.
But I think just going to school in the States, you just kind of want to blend in. So eventually you know, your accent evolves with time. And we live in the UK. Sometimes I wish I had a British accent just to, you know, blend in, but it is what it is. I'm too old for that now.
Yeah. Would you have a book to recommend? One book you would be able to give to everyone?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you asked me that, because there's multiple books that I'm reading, and it depends on the subject you pick, right? There's a book that I really like, and I think the title, because it's been a while since I read it, but it's like 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism by a guy called Jae Hoong. I think, I can't remember, Jae Wang? I forget his last name. Yeah. It's an amazing book, because if you've had any intuitions about what's broken with capitalism, it's like you read it and you're like, yes, exactly. That's exactly it. What was the title? You found
it's 20 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism by Hei Jun Chang.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an amazing book, because it sort of it makes you realize how much the system that we're operating in is the best we've had. And I think if you've read the book Sapiens, it makes you realize what we used to have is nowhere near as good as what we have. But it also makes you realize how much we still have to figure out. You know, like so I think from a evolution of our financial system, it's an interesting series of books. Like, I think if I were to stack the 3 books together, it would be like read Sapiens, read 23 Things That They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, and then read Rules for a Changing World Order by Ray Dalio. If you read those in that order, I think you'd get a sense for the challenges that we have as humanity in the system of trade that we've created over the history of our existence, and the flaws that it has. And we can sometimes blame those flaws on people, but sometimes they're just the system. Yeah. And the system, some people want to overthrow the system because it's flawed in many ways. This book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You, is a very good way of showcasing that. But the alternatives have not been better. And that's what Sapiens also shows, right? Like it shows, and Ray Dalio's book as well. So I think it's an interesting trio of books to read because they kind of tell different challenges that we have as a civilization to overcome the problems that we've created for ourselves. And then separate to those 3 books, I think, you know, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and Ryan Holiday's The Daily Stoic are super useful from a mitigation of how you react to those challenges that we see on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, so it's this kind of juxtaposition of books, like what we've tried to do to make things work as best we can and why they're flawed, and then what we can do to make ourselves better to deal with those circumstances that are complicated and don't have easy solutions.
Thanks for that wisdom. I've just read actually *Sapiens* out of all of those things. I've read some of Ray Dalio's books, but not this one. I think we're good. Most of the time, I end up with that question. If you have that answer, what would you tell to this young Carlos living in Honduras before he goes to the US? If you had the chance to whisper something to his ear, like in a
I think one of the things that we all have is a story in our heads of what will make us happy. And I ended up in the UK for various reasons we didn't fully get into earlier in the podcast, but I wasn't expecting to end up in the UK. When I was younger, I didn't expect I was going to be in the UK. And yet I'm the happiest I've ever been being in the UK. And I think sometimes we forget that happiness isn't correlated with getting what you want. Sometimes it's getting something you don't expect, and having it turn out to be much better than what you had hoped for. And I think that's probably what I would tell myself. It'd be like, a lot of the things that you think aren't going to be good are going to be better than you think. And some of the things that you think are good aren't going to be what you expect them to be.
Thank you. It was great to have you here. For all of you guys who have been listening to this podcast till now, I'm happy if you keep follow the podcast on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Obviously, you will have to learn French for the next episode, some of them. I have some other episodes we'll put in the description that are pretty cool, with Perry Chen, the founder of Kickstarter, I told you about Robert Plummin. I'll send some of the English-speaking podcasts I've shared. I'd be happy to talk to you on LinkedIn everywhere. And we'll do another episode someday.
Sounds good. Anytime, man.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
So did I. Bye-bye. Hey, well done. You've listened to this episode of Génération Do It Yourself all the way through. Please share it with people around you and force your friends to subscribe to the podcast on their smartphone. Give it also a 5-star rating and a nice comment on Apple Podcasts. That would help me to stand out of the crowd. Finally, don't forget that if you need a tech and creative support, the whole Cosa Vostra team will pamper you as it should be if you write us on jdiy@cosavostra.com. I am Matthieu Stefani. Bisous.